Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Opening statements. Before my opening statement, I would like to also to request unanimous consent to submit Chairman Lucas's opening statement for the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I would like to welcome everyone to this morning's hearing, Science and Technology at the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm pleased to welcome EPA Administrator Michael Regan for the very first time in front of the Science Committee. In fact, this is the first time any EPA Administrator has testified since 2019, so we certainly have a lot here to discuss, so thank you for coming. While I appreciate you joining us today, I have to say that your testimony was sent to the committee unacceptably late. We require witnesses to share their written testimony no less than 48 hours ahead of our hearings. This isn't an arbitrary deadline. Our members need time to review your statements, sir, so we can fully prepare for these discussions and ask thoughtful, informed questions. We invited you to testify in July, so you had plenty of time to meet this deadline. And while I know you have an internal review process, previous administration witnesses have had no problem getting us their testimony on time. Given the importance of science at EPA, it's my hope, and Chairman Lucas's, that the Administrator will come before this committee regularly in the future. So I expect that the next time you'll join us, we'll have your testimony ahead of time so we can have the most productive discussion possible. I anticipate that much of today's conversation will focus on the use of science and technology in EPA's regulatory and, when necessary, deregulatory agenda. And although it's been a while since we've heard it, every EPA administrator that has come before our committee has stressed the need for scientific integrity at the EPA and the importance of relying on the expertise of career staff and scientists when crafting the regulations and policies of the agency. That reliance on science is especially important today, given the fact that the Biden administration's EPA has promulgated 1,083 rules to date. That's nearly 55 rules a month since the President took office. There is no industry exempt from the wide range of topics these rules cover, from pesticides in agriculture to emissions for power plants. To chemicals in manufacturing, regulations have the potential to hamstring our economy if not achievable and based on science. Administrator Regan's EPA has set very ambitious goals, reducing emissions from the power sector by 80%, having 2/3 of the cars on the road be zero emission, and nearly eliminating all methane emissions in the country, just to name a few. Admirable as those may be, we simply cannot set goals without analyzing the economic and social costs to achieve them. We can't just flip the switch off for domestic fossil energy production unless we have reliable and affordable replacements. Otherwise, hospitals and military bases would go dark, families would struggle to make ends meet, businesses would close, and lives would be lost. We need to be realistic about what these goals require from the people we serve. Additionally, today's hearing is an opportunity to get an update from the Administrator on the $100 billion influx of funding the agency has received through the IIJA and IRA. No matter what side of the political spectrum you sit on, this pace of spending is undeniably vulnerable to the waste, fraud, and abuse. This funding has set the potential to positively impact crucial sectors of our economy, but it also has the potential to fund wasteful projects that line the pockets of select environmental groups and prop up technologies that will never achieve success on their own in the market. So we must carefully examine the agency's processes to set up new programs, get money out the door, and monitor the progress of projects well into the future. I want to thank the Administrator for being here today, and I'll end with a bit of sentiment. Testifying is a lot like a doctor's appointment. While we're purposefully looking for things that are wrong, and you'll hear criticisms on how things look, it's because we want to prevent actions from turning into an unfixable problem. Everyone here wants an effective, smoothly running environmental protection agency, and today is a necessary step to ensure that. I hope we can work together to ensure EPA is doing things for people and not to people. I now would like to recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from California, for her opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for being here with us today. Before saying anything else, I just want to say how delighted I am to see Chairman Lucas back here. Mr. Lucas, on behalf of all members and staff on this side of the aisle, we're wishing you continued success on your recovery. We stand ready to do whatever we can to assist, and it's just really terrific to see you back. I also want to discuss the EPA's research and development work. You know, the EPA has a unique and really an important mission to put human and environmental health at the center of everything they do. The Office of Research and Development serves a crucial role in that mission. The office drives the science that the regulatory offices depend on to ensure they're setting health protective standards. It puts out state-of-the-art assessments that state, local, and tribal governments rely on to protect their residents. EPA laboratories across the country monitor air for pollutants, soil for contaminants like PFAS, and water to track viruses, including COVID-19. All Americans, whether they know it or not, depend on EPA to deliver on its clear mandate to prioritize health and safety above all else. Now, under your leadership, this EPA has made incredible efforts to bring this mission to environmental justice communities. These communities have been on the front lines of really devastating pollution by industry and sometimes by the federal government itself. Some bear an incredibly high risk of cancer due to unfettered dumping by chemical companies. Others worry that environmental contaminants and anemic government responses will have irreversible impact on their children's development. They have been neglected in programs that have prioritized clean water, energy efficiency, and climate resilience in other better resourced areas. EPA's new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights is an important step in addressing these needs and connecting these communities with much-needed information and resources. I'm proud of the work we did in the last Congress to fund this effort. The Inflation Reduction Act provided $41 billion to the agency to advance environmental justice, and the bipartisan infrastructure law included $50 billion to improve water infrastructure and quality. I look forward to hearing how Congress can continue to support this important work. Now, I would be remiss not to note the larger context of this meeting today. We're hurtling towards a government shutdown. There's infighting taking priority over the functioning of our government and, by extension, the health and well-being of all Americans. Administrator Regan is a perfect witness to put this into perspective. This year, we've seen at least 23 weather and climate-related disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion. In the thick of hurricane season, how will EPA determine that it's safe to drink the water following the next devastating storm? EPA provides rapid response to man-made disasters as well. What if there's another catastrophic train derailment like we saw earlier this year in Ohio? EPA can't effectively respond and inform evacuation orders if their hands are tied by this manufactured crisis. I hope your testimony, Mr. Regan, can inform the larger body of just how many serious consequences of the shutdown that we face would exist. As you know from my previous comments, I also want to raise the issue of the last leaded fuel in transportation, and that is leaded fuel in general aviation airlines. We have a situation where children are being poisoned by the lead in these fuels. We have a study out of my own county showing that the airborne particles from emissions in small planes have actually elevated the lead in the blood level of children near that airport to rival Flint, Michigan. We need to do something soon and aggressive about this health problem, and I'm hoping you can talk further about that as this hearing goes on. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to our witness's testimony and our opportunity to ask him further questions, and I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member, and I'd now like to introduce the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Lucas, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know my official opening statement's been entered into the record, but I would like to take just a moment to thank the ranking member and all the subcommittee chairmen who have handled the hearings while I've been gone, and for that matter, the membership on both sides of the room. This committee is a very productive committee. We're very focused. Your ability to accomplish things in my absence, I'm very appreciative of. And while I may move a little slower for a little bit longer, I have great expectations about what we're going to accomplish in the rest of this session. And again, thank you to all my colleagues. You've been wonderful. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now would like to recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Mrs. Ross, to introduce our witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, it's wonderful to see Chairman Lucas back. We have missed him, and he has been such a great leader of this committee. It is a privilege to introduce my friend and fellow North Carolinian Administrator Michael Regan. Administrator Regan's distinguished service at the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality set a strong example for other states around the country. And now we're sharing him with the whole country. He's been a real champion in addressing PFAS contamination in particular. My North Carolina colleague, Congressman Rouser, and I have seen the world-class water treatment facility on the Cape Fear River, and our state and local governments would not have gotten to this point without Administrator Regan's outstanding work in this area. Now at the EPA, he and his staff are working tirelessly to tackle the PFAS contamination problem and many others. He recognizes that we have a duty at the federal level to protect the health and safety of our people, our communities, and our environment in order to move this country forward. Thank you for your leadership, Administrator Regan, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Administrator Regan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Well, good morning, everyone. And Chairman Lucas, thank you for personally inviting me in April at the House Agriculture Committee to join you today. I'm glad to be here. Ranking Member Logfrin and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the role of science at the Environmental Protection Agency. Protecting public health and the environment is EPA's privilege and greatest responsibility. And as a science-based agency, sound and reliable science is central to all of our work. EPA continues to uphold the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to relying on science to address public health and environmental challenges like PFAS, the climate crisis, lead, air quality, water quality, wildfires, threats to children's health, and many others. As we do this important work, we're guided by the fundamental belief that the health of people, of our environment, and our economy go hand in hand. We have a golden opportunity not only to make communities healthier and safer, but to also deliver life-changing programs in these communities that can catalyze local economic growth and good-paying jobs. And we're committed to scientific integrity to help us achieve our ambitious climate and economic goals. Our dedicated and talented staff work on so many critical issues, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of our work with you today. Over the past 2 years, we've taken strides to ensure that all people have access to clean and safe drinking water. For far too long, communities across the United States have been exposed to harmful PFAS. That's why in October 2021, EPA released its PFAS Strategic Roadmap, a coordinated strategy to protect the public and environment from this deadly chemical compound. As the science continues to develop, we know more now than ever about PFAS and how it can cause adverse health impacts that can devastate entire communities. Earlier this year, EPA proposed the first ever legal limits for PFAS, informed by the hard work and analysis of EPA scientists. We expect to issue a final drinking water rule in the coming months. And while science has helped us make significant progress, we still have a lot of work to do to increase our understanding of PFAS. Our scientists are focused on methods to detect and measure PFAS in our environment, on understanding the risks that PFAS have on our health and our ecosystems, and on ways we can reduce PFAS that are already in our environment. EPA will continue making progress by working in close collaboration with tribes, states, communities, and other stakeholders, including Congress, to enact and implement PFAS solutions that follow the science and that stand the test of time. Science isn't just about finding problems, it's about fixing them. That's why I'm grateful to Congress for providing $10 billion from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to address emerging contaminants, which we have begun distributing. I'm hopeful and optimistic that EPA's science would lead to a cleaner and healthier future for all. EPA is also using science to help address many of the issues wildfires present to our health and to our environment. Over the past 20 years, the numbers of acres burned annually due to wildfires in the United States has doubled. Wildfires are a major source of air pollution, and emissions can travel thousands of miles, impacting the health of millions. This past summer, we saw the smoke from wildfires in Canada bring dangerous air pollution to the Midwest and the East Coast, and last month, we saw how wildfires in Maui brought unimaginable loss to families, homes, and businesses. EPA scientists are developing new ways to model and monitor those emissions and are working to understand what additional toxins might be present in the smoke, particularly from wildfires that cross into urban areas and burn man-made structures. Lastly, I'd like to speak about the work our agency has done involving lead exposure. The science is clear. There is no safe level of exposure to lead, period. EPA is and has been a leader in President Biden's whole-of-government approach to protecting families and children from lead exposure. To date, this administration has funded the removal of over 100,000 lead service lines, and that number will significantly increase thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. Our scientists will continue to research and develop new ways to reduce lead exposure until we meet President Biden's goal of replacing 100% of lead service lines. EPA is committed to taking actions that are backed by sound, quality, and peer-reviewed science. From our actions to address and clean up PFAS, to providing information that helps people during wildfires, to decisions that protect our nation's drinking and recreational waters, science is the backbone of all we do at EPA. And while I'm proud of the foundation we've laid, there is still much more work to do to ensure that all of our children have safe, healthy places to live, learn, and play. So thank you all for the opportunity to be here today and to submit testimony for the record. I look forward to our continued partnership and to achieve these ambitious yet necessary goals, and welcome all questions. Thank you.
I thank the administrator for his testimony. Thank you again, sir. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Chemistry companies in Ohio generate roughly around $3.5 billion in earnings and $1.3 billion in taxes, and exports from the production plants exceed $6.5 billion. That's why I'm concerned by the EPA's proposed updates to the new chemicals regulation under the Toxic Substance Control Act, known as TSCA, particularly as it relates to PFAS and the manufacturing of semiconductors. The Semiconductor Industry Association went as far as saying this proposed action would have a devastating effect on U.S. competitiveness and would result in the semiconductor industry being unable to manufacture devices in the U.S. Administrator Regan, has EPA measured the economic consequences of these actions, and has the EPA sought input from the Department of Commerce, which is investing $50 billion in U.S. semiconductors that your agency might completely shut down?
Well, first I'd like to say that during my time as state regulator, I've spent time with families, the mothers and children that have been poisoned by PFAS. I've seen it firsthand. That being said, I brought that experience to EPA. I believe we're developing very responsible regulations. Yes, I've met with the leadership of the National Association of Manufacturers. I've met with the American Chemistry Council. I've met with CEOs from industry. There is a way that we can do this where we protect the environment and people and economic development. They are not mutually exclusive. So I've been in these conversations as late as last week with industry leaders and green CEOs, and I think there's a path forward, again, where we don't have to compromise global competitiveness while we protect our families and our communities.
And thank you for that answer, but have you been working with the Department of Commerce at all, or sought any input from them in general? Or
We have, yes. I think the President pledged from day one that approaching PFAS would be a whole-of-government approach. So not only the Department of Commerce, I've sat down and had conversations with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretaries of Agriculture. EPA is not doing any of this work in a vacuum because we understand the impact that it has on our society.
Communication's key, I agree.
Yeah.
In March, I wrote to you along with several of my colleagues requesting information on the process and procedures that the EPA has taken in cleanup efforts for the East Palestine train derailment in my home state of Ohio. But just a week or so ago, interagency communications obtained by a FOIA showed that several chemical and environmental monitoring experts were not part of the disaster response until a full month after the derailment. Even more alarming, 2 of EPA's own scientists discussed their concern regarding the lack of testing for dioxins, a highly toxic chemical. Even the former director of the National Toxicology Program said of EPA's response, "Lots of thinking went on!" Exclamation point. So, Administrator Regan, are there actions EPA is taking to remedy this delayed response, specifically related to dioxin sampling, and instill public trust in its scientific findings?
Well, first, I'd like to say that EPA was on site within hours of the derailment, and we're still there. We've been working hard around the clock. I think what we've done in terms of having our conversations, both internally and externally, is looking at the appropriate response to what the science determines. Now, we never believed that dioxin was present, but because the community was alarmed, but because so many people asked for that, we decided to institute additional testing for dioxin, which we did not find. But we wanted to do that not only to alleviate the concerns of those in the community, but as we exported the waste to other waste facilities across the country, they had those questions as well. My decision was we need to do the testing, do it very quickly, because we don't need any interruption in the cleanup and the export of that waste. I stand by the science, and I believe we have done exactly what we need to do to protect that community.
Thank you, Administrator. As major criticism of EPA's response has been the agency's deference to the railroad company and giving so much authority to them in conducting sampling and crafting the protocols to do so, in response to our letter, EPA said there are no plans for the agency to perform long-term studies and that other organizations will undertake such efforts. Given this criticism, does EPA still stand by that plan? And if so, what steps will you take to verify the accuracy of these studies and protect the citizens of Ohio?
Well, I think I said it fairly simple from day one. We were going to hold the perpetrator accountable. And Norfolk Southern, just like any other perpetrator, is on the hook to foot the bill and do the work with the appropriate oversight from EPA. Listen, we've been overseeing the cleanup work from day one. Norfolk Southern has done everything to date that we've asked for. And I think you saw from the President's executive order last week, there are other agencies involved. We will continue to sample. We will continue to monitor. We will continue to stay there with the people of East Palestine. But there are also other agencies that have been brought in to do longer-term studies and looking into some of the things that go along with a very serious disaster like this one.
Thank you, Administrator. And the one thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up, and if you could just do me a favor, and I really do mean it, if you could talk to the President and get him to come to East Palestine. You know, he said that he would. We would like him to come, and it really would mean a lot to the people there, regardless of political affiliation. I think it would really mean a lot for everything that they've gone through. I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member, Lofgren, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Reagan, I want to ask you a question first about the subject I referenced in my opening statement, and it's something I've been dealing with for quite some time. Leaded fuels are the primary fuel for piston engine aircraft. I mean, jets don't use, commercial airlines don't use leaded fuel. It's just the piston engine small aircraft, which comprise really the bulk of the general aviation sector. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, has concluded, based on scientific studies, that there is no known safe level of lead in the blood. What this means is that residents near general aviation airports live with lead exposure in the air and ground every day. Now, as I mentioned, there is a small airport in the district I represent, Reed Hillview Airport. The county of Santa Clara commissioned a scientific study and found that the blood levels of children in the neighborhood surrounding the airport had lead levels that were rivaling that in Flint, Michigan. And so it's very important that we get the lead out of this last part of transportation and protect the children of this country. Congress instructed the FAA to come up with an alternative to leaded avgas, but they haven't been able to get the job done. More recently, various groups have petitioned the EPA to finalize their endangerment finding related to leaded avgas. Now, I'm hopeful that the finding will force the FAA and industry to come up with a plan to stop poisoning children with leaded fuels. Can you provide us with an update as to where this effort stands?
Well, Congresswoman, first of all, I would agree with you that there is absolutely no acceptable level of lead for any of us, but especially our children. So EPA has been very active in this area, working very hard, following the science, following the process for a lead endangerment finding in this area. We're making significant progress, and we believe that we'll have that endangerment finding wrapped up, I believe, this fall. So that process is moving along in a very scientific and orderly way.
So we're in the fall, we could expect this quite soon?
Yes, yes, it will be done this fall, maybe late fall, but this fall. And I don't want to prejudge or predetermine the outcome, but what I want to tell you is we've been very methodical and disciplined on making this determination.
Thank you very much. I just want to touch on another matter. As you know, I'm sure, as everyone in America knows, the House majority has us on the brink of going into what I think is a very irresponsible government shutdown. I don't think that Speaker McCarthy seems to have a plan to keep the government open, and I think that's going to cause real harm to the country and real harm to our constituents. I'm really concerned about the efforts and effects of a shutdown on the EPA. Could you describe the effects of a shutdown on the EPA's work?
Well, I'm gravely concerned as well. You know, I think the EPA has a mission to protect public health and the environment. And while we do have some good systems in place, there is a trust but verify method to that. All of our inspections of our hazardous waste facilities, our Superfund facilities, those inspections will be suspended. The inspections of our water quality, our drinking water, those inspections will be suspended. I think you all were very thoughtful in some congressionally directed projects that will help your districts. That work will be suspended. You know, the emergency personnel and those essential personnel will be there to handle emergencies, but a lot of essential work will begin to slow down. By the way, when we think about pesticides and herbicides and our toxic reviews to get new chemicals in the market so that our farmers are not guessing, that work slows down. So I have grave concerns about a potential shutdown.
Thank you, Administrator, for your testimony, for answering my questions, for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you to the ranking member. I now recognize the chairman, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Regan, thank you for accepting the invitation to come testify before the Science Committee. We had a good discussion that day, the committee did, on both sides of the room in the Ag Committee, and clearly the issues that we both address, this committee and you and your agency, are so intertwined, it's important you be here. But let me ask about an issue that's near and dear to my heart. The EPA is expected to shortly finalize its methane proposal, which includes the super emitter response program, allowing private entities, including, I fear, non-trained, non-governmental officials, to report super emitter events and require follow-up action without any agency involvement or data verification. And equally alarming to me, the proposed rule, as it appears to be headed our way, would establish two technology standards, a less stringent one for the non-trained third parties and a more stringent one for the industry. So I ask this, why is the proposed rule so prescriptive in the technologies industry is allowing to use to detect emissions, but has a much lower standard for environmental activists? Will the EPA maintain a list of false reports and set up prohibitions on repeat offenders? You see where my concern's coming from.
I do, and I appreciate the question. And let me just say, we have received over 500,000 comments on that proposed rule. I've personally spent time.
That says something when you get that many comments.
I've personally spent time with a number of industry CEOs talking about these very issues. What I can say is we take the comment period very seriously. We're looking at how to strengthen all of the issues you've raised so that that final rule will acceptably address all of these issues. Let me just say that we do not want any adverse impacts or unintentional consequences to receiving any kind of false data or any kind of data that jeopardizes the scientific integrity that we have built into this program. So we are looking at every single issue you've raised, and I can guarantee you that we're responding in kind.
Because we don't want to create a system that would appear to the outside world to be hiring bounty hunters who have a lot more flexibility than those who are being pursued, so to speak, right or wrong. And I appreciate that. This same methane rule proposal calls for new compliance requirements at facilities within 2 months of the rule being finalized. A number of industry groups have flagged that supply chain constraints for a range of equipment are certain to cause a delay in meeting that short deadline. And at the same time, I'm aware of only one application to the EPA from a company seeking to use new technology in detecting leaks at oil and natural gas facilities. So Administrator Regan, given the current state of supply chains and the lack of innovative technologies approved to lighten the burden, will EPA consider pushing the deadline for complying with the agency's forthcoming methane rules? Give a little more flexibility?
We're giving a lot of thought to compliance flexibility and compliance deadlines. And again, just last week before last, I sat down with some industry CEOs to talk about this very issue and how we balance the potential impacts to the supply chain. So yes, we are having these discussions. I want to just continually say that a proposal is just that. It's meant to spark a lot of good conversation. And quite frankly, I'm really proud of the conversations we've had with API, with Hess, with Exxon, with BP, and others about how we think about these very complex issues. We all believe that there's a technical solution. The question is, how quickly can we get there? And I think we're having some positive conversations about that.
As you well know, where I live in Oklahoma is a traditional oil and gas, but primarily natural gas area. And methane's money. And the way the equipment, the way the transmission systems, the way the processing has changed dramatically in the last 40 years. Because to lose methane, you're losing money.
Yes.
And they understand that. Well, Mr. Administrator, I appreciate that, and we will keep a very close eye as these rules work their way through the process. But again, thank you for coming. And I suspect over the course of the coming months and years, there'll be a number of opportunities where we will invite you back to discuss our common focus on science and the effective use of it. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Administrator. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Chairman Lucas. And Administrator Regan, thank you for joining us today. I want to start by aligning myself with Representative Ranking Member Lofgren. As the representative for Hillsborough, Oregon Airport, I want to emphasize again the importance of addressing lead pollution. Mr. Administrator, protecting public health and the environment, which is the EPA mission, requires strengthening, not cutting, programs that are proven to work. And thank you, Administrator, for your commitment that the work of the EPA will be informed by rigorous and quality science. The climate crisis is causing more dangerous air quality, as we recently experienced from the dense smoke caused by the Canadian wildfires. We experienced wildfire disasters in Oregon as well. In 2021, the transportation sector contributed nearly 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, which amplifies climate events and disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. There are effective solutions to decarbonize the transit and transportation sectors. For example, in Northwest Oregon, the Beaverton, Oregon School District is investing in quieter and healthier electric school buses. Portland has an electric fire truck, which I got to ride on. And Daimler Trucks is leading the way to electrify the commercial freight trucking industry. But in light of record high temperatures, we need to scale up and expedite this work. So Administrator Regan, needless to say, I'm very concerned about the majority's budget proposal that would cut funding for the EPA's science and technology account by 42% and zero out funding for the agency's vehicle electrification effort. So how would these cuts affect EPA's research and development of emission-reducing technologies?
Well, thank you for that question. And listen, it would significantly hamper progress. I think that in prioritizing people first, we know that these emissions from vehicles are very harmful for public health and human health, especially when we think about our children, our most precious cargo that ride to and from school each day, breathing those diesel fumes. And then we think about what you just talked about, which is exacerbating the climate crisis. I'd like to say that the technologies and the markets are driving this electrification. And so what we're trying to do is propose regulations that can really capture that while also thinking about fuels, advanced biofuels, and others that really contribute to the whole low-carbon technology transition that we want to see, that advances our economy, combats the climate crisis, and really does protect public health. We can't do that without the proper budget. We need the people, we need the scientific rigor, we need the technical analysis, and we need the economic analysis to go with these efforts.
Absolutely agree with you. Now is not the time to be cutting the EPA budget. Administrator Regan, the Supreme Court's decision in Sackett versus the EPA narrowed the definition of waters of the United States, which limited the EPA's scope of authority to regulate under the Clean Water Act. So in light of that opinion, how is the EPA working to protect clean water, and how might these efforts be made more difficult by a potential government shutdown?
Well, listen, I've pledged from day one to follow the science and follow the law. And the Supreme Court spoke, and we immediately sprung into action to address the prescription that they gave to us. With that, we're having to look at all of our programs to be sure that we're leveraging all of our resources and our statutory authorities to protect water quality, our drinking water, our wetlands, and our precosins. We have to do this. It's good for the ecosystem, but as you all know, our wetlands and precosins serve as natural filters for some of these emerging compounds as well. So we're going to use all of our authorities to do so while complying with the law. A government shutdown just hampers our ability to effectively engage, especially with our rural communities who are dealing with these emerging contaminant issues. We want people to have confidence in their drinking water, and if we're not at work, we can't do that.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. And just as a reminder, many of our key environmental laws passed with very strong bipartisan support, and many were signed into law by then President Nixon. So this should not be a partisan issue. Clean air and clean water are critical to the people of the United States, but also to our planet. And as I yield back, I want to note that in your testimony, Administrator Regan, you mentioned that your researchers are studying how native seagrass can store carbon and increase coastal resilience to flooding. As the co-chair of the Bipartisan Oceans Caucus, I am leading the effort on a bipartisan blue carbon bill, which will do just that, plus create jobs in coastal and rural communities. So I'm hoping that we can move that bill forward soon, and I look forward to talking about that in the committee and with the EPA. It's a great opportunity to use the seagrasses, kelp, mangroves as a carbon sink, but also restore habitat at the same time. So, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Posey for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, Administrator Regan.
Yes, good to see you.
Last month, a company in my district that makes outboard motors for its main customer, the U.S. Navy SEALs, was rated by armed agents of the EPA. And I tried to get together and talk to you about this, but your office said it was enforcement sensitive, so I wasn't able to do that. Since this case involves the use of national security exemptions, I just wonder how the EPA dealt with requests seeking regulatory clarity involving national security exemptions.
Well, thank you for that question. And sorry we couldn't get together. I do have some limitations in terms of that specific case because of the Office of Inspector General's investigation and EPA's. But what I would say is the Clean Air Act gives us flexibility to look at Clean Air Act flexibilities for vehicles as it relates to national security interests. So I'd love for our staffs to get together to think about whether or not this specific case outside of the investigation fits into a future discussion with the Clean Air Act flexibility.
Thank you. Do you think it might be possible to expand the exemption to first responders like fire, emergency medical services, law enforcement, and et cetera?
You know, our folks have had some conversations with those entities along with the manufacturers, have not really seen the need for that flexibility. I think most of our flexibilities are reserved for national security interests, but we're open to those discussions, and so I'd love to get our staffs together to talk about that.
This committee has come to learn that the EPA has spent $10 million on advanced combat equipment for enforcement operations. Could you briefly explain why we need advanced combat equipment in the Environmental Protection Agency?
You know, I'm not quite familiar with that piece there, so I'll have to get back get back to you on that piece there.
Okay, I had some more questions about that issue, but I'll respect that, and we'll get back together on it.
Absolutely.
Switching subjects, the EPA's Inspector General sent a memo to the agency in April identifying that grant recipients were not required to disclose foreign support after receiving a grant. This means that an EPA grant recipient could receive both federal funding and foreign support during a grant's period of performance. It also means a country like China could influence the environmental findings that the EPA uses. And so I just wonder if you're familiar with this memo. And it's from the EPA, and inquiring about what steps the agency might take to ensure full transparency from grant recipients since receiving the memo. And I ask you unanimous consent to enter this memo into the record. It's dated April 13th, 2020, and it's Management Implication Report, Disclosure of Foreign Support for EPA Research and Grants.
Into the record.
Thank you.
I'm not quite sure if I know specifically what's in that memo. I can tell you that we have taken a number of steps to strengthen our research grants disclosure requirements consistent with the NDAA of 2021. We've also responded to concerns raised by our Office of Inspector General, and we've updated the terms and conditions of our research grants to ensure that grantees provide disclosures about sources of funding both before they get the grants and on an ongoing basis once they receive those grants. So we have responded to the IG's suggestions there.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Stevens for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mr. Administrator. I wanted to give you some accolades because you are the right person at the right time leading your agency. We have so appreciated your dedication to issues important to us in Michigan. I'll never forget being with you on Belle Isle after we passed the infrastructure law, celebrating the cleanup money that has been dedicated to the Great Lakes. So thank you for your time in Michigan and for your great leadership of the agency. As you probably know, the United Nations estimates that the equivalent of 2,000 garbage trucks of plastic is dumped into the world's oceans, rivers, and lakes every single day. And addressing plastic pollution and improving recycling infrastructure is just absolutely essential. And I have long been a supporter of this work. In my very first year in Congress, as the chair of the Research and Technology Subcommittee on this very committee, we convened the first ever committee hearing on recycling in about a decade, and we called on the EPA to create a national strategy for recycling. And I was pleased to see the EPA released its national strategy for recycling in 2021, and then we went on to found the Congressional Plastic Solutions Task Force. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Administrator, could you provide an update on the national strategy to prevent plastic pollution and how this strategy will support the EPA's work in reducing plastic pollution writ large?
Absolutely. Well, first I wanted to say thank you for your leadership in this area. As I've traveled the country, I've been to probably more than 35 states and over 10 countries. The number two issue young people talk to me about are plastics and recycling. And so in April, we released our draft national strategy for reducing plastic pollution. We released that for comment. We have received over 100,000 comments that we're combing through right now. So we plan to do our due diligence, follow the science, follow the data, and come out with a very strong strategy. And then, I'm really excited that thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law and thanks to Congress, we've recently distributed over $275 million in just solid waste infrastructure for recycling grants to help state and local governments with this very issue. So we're on the job, we recognize how important it is, and we're paying attention.
Yeah, and we salute your agency for the grants work and look towards the future of infrastructure work that we're doing in the Congress to support recycling infrastructure. It seems like we are learning new things on just an almost everyday basis as it pertains to plastic waste and recycling opportunities. Something else, Mr. Administrator, I wanted to ask you is that the EPA is conducting just vital research across the board, but particularly with water, aquatic life, sediments, and the air of the Great Lakes. And the EPA's research vessel, Lake Guardian, is the largest research vessel in the EPA fleet and the largest on the Great Lakes. And having this critical asset functionable and mission ready is vital to the safety of our nation's Great Lakes. So just wanted to give you a minute to provide any updates on the vital work of the research vessel Lake Guardian is doing in the Great Lakes and why this is important to the future of these lakes, and then anything that you could maybe add around cuts to EPA and the work of this vessel for the health and safety of our Great Lakes.
Well, I think this is a vessel that we're extremely proud of. Most people think that it's just purely ecosystems research. We know that the impacts and effects of climate change are changing the physical structure of our Great Lakes. The Great Lakes provide drinking water to millions of people. And so this vessel is critical for scientific research in terms of ecological balance, but also preserving the security for drinking water for so many millions of people. We're proud of the work that that vessel is doing. Cuts in this area are at a significant cost to the people that rely on the Great Lakes for recreation and for sustenance. And so we are continuing to advocate for those research dollars because science will drive the way to a lot of solutions that provide a lot of economic opportunity as well.
Yeah, and the monitoring remains so critical for us. You know, we've seen from times of austerity in the past that cuts to personnel have, just greatly damaged, I think, some of the work that my constituents rely on to maintain the health and safety of our Great Lakes. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Administrator, thank you for showing up and talking to us and answering questions. The EPA has proposed multiple rules for regulating greenhouse gas, GHG, emissions from the power sector, which I'll refer to collectively as the proposed 111 rule. This rule aims to cut the power sector's greenhouse gas pollution 80% by 2030. But in reality, according to some, stated by utility providers themselves, this rule will only serve to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, significantly raise customers' power bills, and require a rapid transition away from reliable American-produced natural gas without a realistic plan to fully replace that generation. What I really want to focus on, Mr. Administrator, is my feeling that this rule is based on politics rather than science. In fact, one article quoted 6 people who said the White House sent the EPA's original proposal back to your agency and requested that it add more stringent requirements. So, several questions. Did the EPA's original proposal include regulations on existing gas plants only? Yes or no?
So I think what we've done is we've had a back and forth and interaction with experts in the White House on the construct of that rule. I think collectively we agreed that the proposed rule should include existing resources or existing production.
Right, but it seems to have devolved away from just existing. Did the White House ask your agency to change the proposal to include existing gas plants in addition to the future plants?
I think we had a robust conversation internally at the EPA and the White House. So the rule that came out of EPA is a rule that is really grounded in our technological rigor and sound science. And I think we're proud of the rule that we proposed, and we're taking comment on that.
I understand, but what's happened since the rule was proposed is different. Did the White House request that the proposal require coal plants to curb emissions 90% by 2035 or to retire? Yes or no?
Listen, our rule is a reflection of EPA's staff analysis. Okay. We've had conversations with the White House, but I just want to really sort of push back on the premise of that question because it sends a signal that the White House is dictating the rules that EPA proposed.
It does send that signal, and that's why I'm asking these questions.
That's just not the case.
Yes, sir. Broadly speaking, please confirm or deny that the White House did have some level of input on the proposed 111 rule.
Oh, absolutely, we have conversations with the White House on all of our rules.
Thank you. How many staff scientists are employed by the White House Office of Climate Policy? You know?
You know, that question had to be directed to the White House. I'm not sure.
Okay. How many scientists does the EPA employ?
I can get you that answer. I'm
Many.
not quite sure
Many
how many
scientists,
exact
right?
scientists. I want to be exact.
Do you believe that EPA employees who are scientists are some of the best minds in their field and knowledgeable in the most up-to-date science?
Listen, I absolutely agree with that.
All right, yes, sir. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Can you explain why EPA scientists are being overruled by political appointees? And even if that's not the case, or you say so, don't you think that the very fact that political appointees get to set the targets and then the scientists have to crunch the numbers to make it happen and make it get there, that would make for a skeptical public of this proposed rule? And wouldn't you agree that the significant public distrust in the EPA is a massive problem to that agenda?
Well, I'd have to answer that question as a top political appointee and say that I listen to my scientists, and I think my scientists would corroborate that. And so that rule reflects what I think is really hard technical rigor. But let me just say, I've met in the past 2 to 3 weeks with industry CEOs on a lot of these issues, and we're receiving a lot of feedback. I think that the final rule will reflect the thinking of our scientists plus industry scientists and how we land this final rule.
Well, thank you very much. It looks like, well, I've still got a little bit more time. You think these 6 individuals that were I believe came out of the EPA that spoke with this group, gave us this information, were those 6 individuals scientists? Because I'm under the understanding that they were.
I'm not
They have
quite sure of
concerns.
who the 6 individuals are you're referring to.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. I'll yield back then.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Bowman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Mr. Administrator, for being here today and for your exemplary leadership in protecting our environment and our communities. I'd like to ask you about the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, or TICTACs, which you have played a key role in funding and selecting. These 16 centers are going to be instrumental in helping vulnerable communities take advantage of climate, infrastructure, and R&D funding. They're going to be crucial for making Justice 40 a reality. How has the EPA helped the TICTACs to get off the ground, and how do you plan to stay involved in the process to make sure they are a success? Will EPA's regional administrators help coordinate between the TICTACs, state and local governments, and communities applying for funding?
Well, thank you for that question, and we're really proud of these technical assistance centers because it demonstrates that the solutions aren't top-down. The federal government shouldn't dictate all of the solutions, that these solutions come from our communities. And so we're providing technical assistance, as you've stated, using 17 centers all across the country. Each of these centers have been awarded approximately $10 million. They have connected with local universities, they've connected with local NGOs, and people who can provide the technical assistance to those who are on the front lines and working in these communities. To your point, yes, our regional administrators will be involved, but so will our new National Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, who serves as the facilitator for all the work that we do to ensure that environmental justice and equity is central to every single thing we do.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'd also like to ask about how our K-12 public school system fits into your vision and plan for IRA implementation. And I also asked Secretary Granholm about this when she joined us a couple weeks ago. So public schools, as you know, are the heartbeats of our communities. Our next generation of STEM and STEAM visionaries are public school students, and as you know, too many schools are struggling right now with toxic pollution, crumbling infrastructure, inefficient energy systems, and the impacts of extreme weather driven by climate change. In many cases, these issues have to be addressed holistically. Can you please talk to us about what is happening at EPA and in coordination with DOE and other agencies to help public schools take full advantage of all relevant funding opportunities?
Absolutely. The first thing I'd say is DOE is a very strong partner in these TICTACs, and the purpose of these TICTACs is to ensure that all of these communities and our state and local governments understand the full breadth of resources available to reduce pollution and climate pollution. And so we're excited about that in terms of our partnership with DOE and other agencies. The Inflation Reduction Act creates billions of dollars for our state and local governments to apply for pollution reduction grants, which we're excited to say that our cities and our localities and our schools should be able to participate in that process. The thing that I'm most proud of is how many school districts across this country are applying for the electric school bus and low-carbon school bus grants. This is really revolutionizing how our children get to school and reducing those burdens that so many of them face, especially having asthma attacks and respiratory distress before they can even get into the classroom at 8 a.m. So we're excited about that, really excited about that.
Thank you so much for that. One final question. Can you give us a status update on Justice 40 implementation from EPA's perspective? What do you see as some successes so far, and what are some challenges so far?
Listen, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Justice 40 is the floor for us. I believe that we have designed a program and process at EPA to ensure that the most vulnerable are the first in line. Whether you're in Appalachia, West Virginia, or the Black Belt of Alabama, there are communities that have been on the receiving end disproportionately. And so in many of our programs, we have not only met but exceeded Justice 40. When I think about resources coming from our Superfund program and our Brownfields program, when I think about programs where we distribute our water quality resources, we're ensuring that the communities that have not had a seat at the table have a seat at the table and get some of those protections. By the way, many of our rural communities all across the country fit into that very category.
Thank you so much, and again, thank you for your exemplary leadership. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Baird for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we really appreciate you being here today to test. Anyway, the question I have really goes on and with what Congressman Babin was talking about, the Section 111 proposed rule. And it mentioned specifically this proposed rule indicates that carbon capture is a technology that can be used to comply with this rule. So carbon capture projects in many states and regions require the EPA to issue Class 6 wells for the injection of carbon. So my question is, how many Class 6 well permits has the EPA issued this year?
I'll have to get you the specific number of this year. I know that the most recent, we're on track for looking at how West Virginia and Louisiana can participate in our Class 6 program, and it's my understanding that Texas has just recently in August made a Class 6 well application. So I will say this, that the President has pledged that carbon capture technologies will be a part of how we move forward. The Class 6 well program is aligned with that, and there's a commitment at EPA to get these Class 6 well permits out.
And along that same line, then, do you anticipate more being in the pipeline and as we move forward?
I do. I anticipate that we've really figured out some program efficiencies, especially as we've worked with Louisiana and as we work with West Virginia. We've identified a number of efficiencies and are prepared to move forward as expeditiously as possible because we see this as part of the solution, not everywhere, but in some places around the country.
And I think you make a good point in that. In trying, so how because it helps answer the situation, how can utilities really make plans if they don't have, and it requires these Class 6 permits? So I guess I'm just making a comment in order for them to move forward, we need to be moving forward with those Class 6 permits. So now another area I'd like to go into, my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Miller, brought to your attention, discussed the EPA's handling of the East Palestine train derailment in February. And without a doubt, I hold the highest assurance for Heritage's ability in my area to handle the contaminated material. However, I felt the process was somewhat disorganized as it was laid out, and as my constituents had extreme concerns about the fact that this material was moving to their area and coming to Rosedale, Indiana. And so Senator Braun and I wrote you a letter back in March. It took about 55 days to get an answer to that. So anyway, the questions that I have relates to that letter. And if the chairman will allow, I'd like to submit that letter for the record.
Without objection.
So, so I guess I'm down to trying to figure out why some of the facilities were not approved, and yet the Rosedale, Indiana is quite a distance from East Palestine, and so how that selection process worked, and why some of these other sites, like Victory, Ohio, Liverpool, Ohio, some of those sites were not selected.
Well, and thank you for that question. And so, you know, when we have a perpetrator of an incident like the one in East Palestine, they're responsible for identifying and selecting the sites. So Norfolk Southern gave us a list of sites that they thought were capable of handling these particular waste streams. I know that they exhausted the number in Ohio, in state that they could, so they started to look at other states as well. It's our job, once Norfolk Southern submits the desired location, to approve or disapprove based on the certification. And so that's what we did during that process. I know that because East Palestine was so highly visible, that there was a lot more controversy around who was receiving these wastes. But I would agree with you that companies like Heritage and others all across the country receive these kinds of wastes all the time and handle them with the utmost integrity. And we didn't anticipate anything different on this one.
Thank you very much for that answer. I see that I'm out of time, so I just think that process really needs constant review. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. I now recognize Ms. Ross for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, Administrator Regan, for being with us today. I also want to thank all of your employees at the Research Triangle headquarters. I visited with them recently, and they are inspired by your work and doing fabulous work there, and let's hope the government doesn't shut down so that none of them have compromised paychecks over the next few weeks and months. Back to the PFAS issue. As you know, PFAS chemicals affect our drinking water, our crops, the air we breathe, and the products we bring into our home. And they've contaminated more than 2,300 sites across 49 states, polluting the drinking water of an estimated 200 million Americans, including thousands of households in North Carolina, as you know very well. These forever chemicals have been associated with a wide range of serious health effects, including probable link with cancer, thyroid disease, lower fertility, and more. But we know very little about what these chemicals really are, where they are manufactured and used, and how the American people are being exposed. It is vital for EPA to define PFAS in a way that will not deprive the agency, Congress, states, and the public of information necessary to address their harmful effects efficiently and effectively. I've led bipartisan legislation that has twice passed the House that would direct the EPA to use a simple definition of PFAS: one fully fluorinated carbon atom. That is consistent with the international consensus definition. This definition would ensure that we have a full picture of the nature and extent of PFAS effects, enabling Congress and the administration to formulate an effective plan of action to address the problem. I'm hopeful that the EPA's PFAS reporting rule under the Toxic Substances Control Act will help us capture the full picture of contamination in the U.S. How is EPA going to ensure that its definition accurately reflects the scope of the pollution crisis and the wide range of chemicals our communities are suffering from, in particular PFAS pollution from fluoropolymers in North Carolina?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for that question. And so we've recently issued our third test order on this PFAS substance because we are in a continual collection mode of what these health effects are. To the point you made, there are so many of these chemical compounds that are out in our environment that we don't understand the health implications. So in terms of following the science and following the law from our regulatory standpoint, we have testing requirements under the order that will improve our understanding, and we have a national PFAS strategy that spans not only our TSCA program, but our cleanup programs, our air programs, and our water programs. So we're really trying to get our arms wrapped around what do we do with what's already in the environment, and how do we work with industry to ensure that we don't continue to put it into the environment.
Okay, great. On a different topic, this administration has made significant investments in the transition to electric vehicles, especially as made possible through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. We had the privilege of speaking with Secretary Granholm in this committee earlier this month about what the Department of Energy is doing to advance this transition. Can you elaborate on the work that EPA is undertaking to advance this transition?
Well, I can say that we have a proposed rule for our cars and trucks that looks at the opportunity for electric vehicles to lower carbon pollution, along with advanced biofuels and some other technologies that can pull carbon out of the air. You know, I laugh because I think that what we are doing is trying to codify a technology that industry is out the gates with. You have the major car companies running $1 million Super Bowl ads talking about how quickly they're going to electrify the future. We have over $500 billion in private sector investment into manufacturing and ensuring that we can do this domestically, where our technology standards for cars and trucks and vehicles ensures that we leverage the full potential of electric vehicles to meet the demands of the emission reductions for the climate crisis. I think we are in line with where the industry and technologies are going, and we want to be sure that we give industry the regulatory certainty to continue to make those major investments.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Regan, for your willingness to be here today. I'd like to ask a question about the greenhouse gas reduction fund that the EPA is attempting to establish. It's trying to get $20 billion out the door this year, which is obviously a staggeringly large amount of money to try and move in 1 year. Recently, a Freedom of Information Act request revealed that the EPA had a series of meetings last November with potential awardees of grants from that fund. And that raised concerns that the EPA was picking winners and losers, essentially. Is it normal practice to have meetings, exclusive meetings with potential awardees of grants from a fund, particularly when the public comment period for that fund hasn't closed yet?
Yeah, I'd have to say that I think we met with just about everybody under the sun to try to articulate the design or the intentions of the program. I would argue that, you know, once we got beyond initial conversations, when we got into the design of the program, we had the proper safeguards in place to be sure that, number one, no one was unfairly advantaged, and number two, those who could potentially be a recipient would not be involved in the design discussions. I can say that I met with private equity, hedge fund, venture capital, Wall Street, commercial bankers, but I also met with CDFIs, state and local governments. So we really tried to be sure that we understood sort of the full breadth of the impact of this program. And I think you recognize that we've designed competitions so that those who are experts in leveraging capital can take that $20 billion and pull hundreds of billions of dollars off the sidelines to invest in low carbon technologies.
Sure. Well, speaking of those safeguards, one of the things that was revealed through that Freedom of Information Act request was the fact that a former senior attorney for the Sierra Club was one of the required attendees from the EPA at a meeting that included the Sierra Club. Is that a conflict of interest, or would that fall into something that you think would be impermissible?
I'd have to look into the specifics of that because this is the first time I've heard that. Again, we've instructed, I've had a number of conversations actually with our Office of Inspector General on how to conduct and design these programs, and as far as I know, we are meeting that letter of the law.
All right. Well, I appreciate you if you could look into that and get back to us on it, because, I mean, obviously, we would never want the public to think that government had its thumb on the scale when it came to who was eligible for and received funding from this grant fund.
Absolutely.
In talking for a moment about nuclear energy, I know that we're all aware that we have a big problem with the disposal of nuclear waste, and regardless of what one's thoughts are on nuclear energy, I think we should all be able to agree that storing spent fuels in casks on site at these decommissioned nuclear power plants is not best practice or in the keeping of our obligation to protect the environment. What is the EPA doing to try to promulgate long-term solutions to this problem?
Well, I would say that we work very closely with the Department of Energy on that waste storage issue. But let me be clear, I'm from the state of North Carolina. Over 50% of the base load is nuclear energy. We see nuclear energy as a low emissions technology that can help us combat the climate crisis and public health issues. So I think we have to stay laser focused on how we store the waste and proliferation as we begin to also look at new and advanced modular nuclear technologies. But I want to be clear, we work very closely and hand with the Department of Energy on how we handle the storage of that waste.
Right. Well, let's keep working on those solutions, because I think it's something that is a goal that we all share. And then lastly, talking about some of the PFAS regulations that your agency is promulgating, I just want to sound a cautionary note. I think we all share the goal of providing clean, safe, affordable drinking water to all Americans, but it's not enough just to establish new detection technologies and new regulations, because if we're not giving our water agencies the tools to remove those hazardous chemicals from the water, we really haven't accomplished anything. I mean, we can pretend we put a new regulation on them and, you know, problem solved, but if there's not the technology to remove that from water, or if it's too expensive, or if we're forcing these agencies to build that into the cost of drinking water that makes it unaffordable, you know, we really haven't solved the problem. So I hope we can all work together on that. I see my time's expired, though. And thank you very much for being here today and for your willingness to testify before the committee. I think it's very helpful. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Sorensen for 5 minutes of questioning.
I want to thank Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Lofgren for convening this hearing, and Administrator Regan for your willingness to appear before us. Also, it was really great to see Chairman Lucas back in our Science Committee this morning. I'd like to thank Administrator Regan for visiting my hometown of Rockford, Illinois, earlier this year to witness replacement of lead service lines into homes, families. We're solving the problems. The district that I represent, the Illinois 17th Congressional District, we have some of the highest percentages of lead service lines of any district in the country. Last Congress, we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which included funds for lead pipe replacement. I'm proud of my colleagues for the work they put into that bill and the work that we're doing today, we're all doing today, to keep communities safe and healthy. But as we're all aware, Congress is facing an appropriations cliff. As of right now, we do not have a set plan to fund the government beyond this weekend. Should the government shut down, what would be the impact of that shutdown for beneficial programs like lead service line replacement that the EPA is implementing?
Well, thank you for hosting me in your district, and it really was a good day. And it's always a good day when you watch the extraction of lead service lines and you see families throughout the neighborhood celebrating. We run the risk of not seeing those celebrations if we have a shutdown. Simply put, the work just can't get done. We've got $15 billion that we want to get out to eradicate lead service lines, both on the public and private side. This money tackles both of those. And without the EPA employees in place to do the work, we just hit the pause button. And that exposes children, the elderly, everyday families, exposes them more to lead in the drinking water.
Before I was elected to Congress, I served my community as a meteorologist for 22 years. I was one of the first people to talk on local television about the impacts of climate change. I represent family farmers in Western Illinois that have generations. I've seen these books of old weather records that go way back. People understand there's a change, as you and I do as well. I'm proud that John Deere and Company is focused on precision ag and lowering inputs and emissions. I'm proud that the new Amazon delivery trucks, the EV trucks, are built in my district by Rivian. And the administration, I'm thankful, is focused on the climate crisis, implementing a whole-of-government approach. Could you elaborate on what role the EPA is playing in this government-wide, but also public and private approach to addressing the climate crisis? And can you expand on how the EPA is engaging in smaller communities to solve the crisis?
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time with Secretary Vilsack thinking through how we use voluntary and regulatory tools for our small rural communities, as well as our larger communities. I think it takes a holistic approach. And so I am spending a lot of time engaging the private sector. We cannot solve this problem without the private sector. So we have great opportunities like this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, question that was raised about billions of dollars in investment. But we also have the responsibility to engage with the regulated community, with the ag community, on how do we get the best technologies at the commercial scale to ensure we are combating the climate crisis and using every tool in the toolbox. So I have a great deal of respect for USDA, for Commerce, for DOE, for DOT, and you know, the president sets the tone. And he indicated from day one that we would all work together, and I'm really glad we all like each other because we're all working together very closely.
Well, I hope you're feeling that here from the Science Committee as well, because this is a group of people here in Congress that are here to solve the problems of the American people. We put politics aside in this room, and we solve the problems because we know there are real people. We know there's another generation and a generation after that that are going to look back into 2023 and say, what did we do as things were changing? It's got to be a scientific approach. Yeah. I appreciate what you do with the EPA, and Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Crawford, now recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. The EPA recently offered a proposal, the Vulnerable Species Pilot, which I have some concerns with, and I think most people in ag and forestry and other pesticide users share that concern. The requirements of this proposal could be impossible to comply with, which would prevent producers from protecting crops and other property. In fact, 4 out of 5 producers claim they'll no longer be able to continue their farming operations if these regulations are enacted. So obviously, it would jeopardize the livelihoods of rural communities. So my question is, can you explain to me why the EPA feels the need to put in place such severe restrictions without even first looking at the science to determine, is there a risk to endangered species? Furthermore, how does this approach reconcile with the EPA's responsibility under the Endangered Species Act and FIFRA to conduct effects determinations and risk assessments?
Well, I appreciate that question, and I think you and I both share a frustration here, which is we've had 30 to 35 years of a lack of compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And as I've discussed quite frequently with Secretary Vilsack, as we try to collectively tackle this issue, the courts have now taken the driver's seat in terms of setting the bars pretty high on EPA not responding to and losing litigation in court. And so what we've attempted to do is work very closely with USDA, resolve some of these litigation issues, and begin to expedite some of the reviews that would comply with the court's guidance, but also bring new products to the market. We do not want our farmers waking up and guessing every single day what's going to be on or off the shelf.
So you mentioned, I've heard you tell 2 different members that you've coordinated with and have a good working relationship with USDA. So my question is, have you coordinated with Fish and Wildlife on this particular proposal? And if not, how does that reconcile with EPA's responsibility under the 2018 Farm Bill and the FY23 Consolidated Appropriations Acts, which required the coordination with Fish and Wildlife? I'm giving you credit for having coordinated with USDA because you've indicated that you have, but other federal co-regulators on proposed ESA pesticide mitigations?
We have. I think we've looked at this issue. I've looked at this issue through a very frustrated lens because I inherited a mess. But we have to solve it.
So if I'm, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but my time is limited.
Sure.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, a lot of this is now in the wheelhouse of the courts. Is that correct?
A lot of it has been, and the courts have made rulings. And where you will see a slight difference sometimes with USDA or U.S. Fish and Wildlife is the court is telling EPA it has to meet that measure. And then we discuss, and quite frankly, maybe USDA or U.S. Fish and Wildlife have a higher appetite for risk. DOJ is serving as our attorney and may say, EPA, you can't afford to do X, Y, and Z. You're seeing a robust discussion across multiple agencies to try to get at some of these issues. And quite frankly, courts like the Ninth Circuit on chlorpyrifos and others have set a really high bar. That bar would not have been that high if we had been on the offense instead of the defense.
Right, and I do think we can agree that this is a very frustrating process, so I definitely think we agree on that front. Let me switch gears real quick. In 2020, the EPA's own scientific risk assessment demonstrated that the risk from lime manufacturing emissions are acceptable with an ample margin of safety and that no new regulations are necessary. Despite that finding, EPA is currently proposing to revise its national emission standard for hazardous air pollutants for the lime manufacturing sector due to a ruling in D.C. court case, Lean versus EPA. An economic analysis of the EPA proposal demonstrates that the rule would impose capital costs of almost $1 billion on an industry with only an annual revenue of about $2.3 billion. So, given that rule would impose significant costs without an appreciable public health benefit, would you commit to adopting the maximum flexibilities under the Clean Air Act to minimize the burden of this rule on lime manufacturing?
I think what we want to do is ensure that we are meeting the letter of the law with as much flexibility as possible. I think we have to be reasonable, and I think what we want to do is protect public health and ensure that these industries can be productive because, of course, all of us rely on the food, fuel, and fiber that this industry produces.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here today, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. I now recognize Ms. Salinas for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome back Chair Lucas. I really appreciate his leadership on this committee and thank the ranking member also for holding this important hearing. Administrator Regan, I want to thank you for being here today. And from clean water and air to ensuring a smooth energy transition, the EPA's work is truly essential to Oregon's health and prosperity. And I'm really grateful for your work to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is already making an impact for my constituents. In February, EPA awarded Oregon $18.9 million to address emerging contaminants like PFAS in drinking water. And the investments really do target our smaller rural communities and our disadvantaged areas. In April in House Ag, you testified and we discussed the Closing America's Wastewater Access Gap Technical Assistance Program. And you assured us then that you were working closely with USDA on 11 pilot projects in communities around the country to provide a roadmap to scale up unified technical assistance and export a successful model all across the country. And for my communities, the issue of technical assistance has really been a priority since day one, since I was first sworn in. My small towns, small farmers, historically really are at a disadvantage in trying to access some of these grants. You know, if they have any kind of assistance in terms of staff capacity, they don't really have the legal expertise and some of the capacity to hunt down these grants in the first place, and they certainly don't have the expertise to apply for them. It's my understanding that Closing America's Wastewater Access Gap program was meant to equip the participating communities with the information they need to apply for funding in fall of 2023, so this year. So my questions are we on track to hit that target, and are there key lessons that you've learned so far in that process?
Well, thank you for that question, and we are on target. We are learning a heck of a lot from these 11 communities. We strategically chose these communities because we knew it wouldn't be a monolithic solution. And so we are prepared, EPA and USDA, to take those learnings from those 11 and export those to ensure that they reflect the breadth of rural communities, smaller communities that will be competitive for these resources. We are on track, and our Office of Water is feeling really good about having the capability to make sure that these communities are competitive for these billions of dollars.
Great. And then once the pilot program wraps up, is there intent to extend the program nationally?
I think the goal is twofold. We will assess whether or not we need to continue to pilot, or we will take those learnings, compile them, and see if we can export that level of learning and technical assistance to those who need it the most. We believe that this 11 is reflective of the country, and we believe that those learnings will help us get that across the finish line.
And is there anything that you need from Congress in order to make sure that this program is successful?
Listen, I would say that the $50 billion that we received from bipartisan infrastructure law to focus on our failing water infrastructure was a huge shot in the arm. But we have over $700 billion in need. And so what I'm hoping is that Congress will see that EPA has used these resources strategically and wisely so that when we look for more resources to help more people, there will be a compelling case to do so.
Thank you. And then, as you know, shifting gears here, China dominates production of many critical minerals essential to the clean energy transition, including lithium and cobalt used in batteries and polysilicon, a key material for producing solar panels. With the CHIPS and Science Act and the IRA, Congress set ambitious climate goals while also seeking to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, priorities that often, for me, seem at odds. And the issue isn't exclusive to the energy sector. I've heard from Intel employees in Oregon that this is top of mind. Tech companies like Intel and their suppliers in my district rely on these minerals to produce semiconductors and other electronics. How does EPA-supported research inform sustainability in mining? And more broadly, how do you think about expanding domestic production of critical materials in an environmentally responsible way?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we believe that we can do it in an environmentally responsible way. We believe that we have to have responsible domestic mining because we cannot rely on China. And since the Inflation Reduction Act, I believe we've seen over $45 billion invested in battery supply investments and supply chain, critical mineral supply chain issues. And so what we do with our regulatory authority is watch what the market is doing, watch where the technologies are going, and in our regulations or technology standards, we try to incorporate best management practices and the best technologies to keep this country globally competitive. That's the goal, and that's EPA's role.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Tenney for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas and Mr. Miller, and also thank you to Chairwoman Lofgren. I want to thank you, Administrator, for your service and for being here and for giving us your transparent answers on the operation of the important functions. And thank you again to Chairman Lucas. Congratulations. I know he's not in here now, but glad to see him back in action. And I just have for the sake of time, I just want to not give you an opening statement, but I really want to dive right in, Administrator. And I'm going to ask you a string of questions, and I just would appreciate a straightforward yes/no answer on these if you could. And my first question is, are you familiar with Arabella Advisors?
Arabella Advisors?
Arabella Advisors.
I am not.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, Council's proposed rule entitled, and I quote, "Disclosure of Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Climate-Related Financial Risk," close quote, that's the proposed rule, which would require major federal suppliers to publicly disclose greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risks, as well as set science-based reduction targets?
I am familiar with FAR.
Okay. This rule was proposed by DOD, GSA, and NASA, which collectively comprise the FAR Council. Did the EPA have any involvement, consultation, coordination, or otherwise in this rule?
We may have had a peripheral. We typically participate in all interagency processes.
So you didn't directly get involved with this, as far as you know?
Our agency could have.
Could have, but you didn't. You
No.
with your staff didn't. Okay.
I didn't personally.
Don't you think that as the Environmental Protection Agency, the premier agency, you should have had some kind of consultation in putting forth this rule on climate emissions, especially affecting major suppliers and entities all over the country?
I believe that our agency may have participated in interagency. I'm just answering you straightforward. I did not participate.
All right. Do you know if the Council on Environmental Quality was consulted?
I assumed that they were because they're part of the interagency process, but as you know, that council's in the White House and I'm not, so.
Okay, appointed by the president. The rule requires major contractors to have their climate targets validated by a company called Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI for short. Are you familiar with SBTI?
I am not familiar
Okay.
with SBTI.
The EPA's website cites SBTI's criteria as a good rule of thumb for companies to align their emission targets with, so you may want to know who they are, because they're going to be actually doing some oversight on behalf of your agency and telling U.S. businesses who they need to align with. I mean, let me also, are you also, since you don't know SBTI, it is a British company, and its interests may not necessarily be aligned with U.S. national security interests. And I just want to say, so everyone knows, is on the same page, including you, I just wanted to inform you, SBTI is a private foreign company that both sets emission reduction targets and validates them for private companies for a fee. According to the EPA's website, this is the agency you run, the EPA's Center for Corporate Climate Leadership is a resource center for all organizations looking to expand their work in greenhouse gas measurement and management. It goes on to say that the center offers resources to help organizations conduct, assess, and reduce their Scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions. From what you understand, and I've described for here, don't the center and SBTI conduct some of those activities?
I am very familiar with the Center
Okay.
for Corporate Climate Leadership.
Okay.
So I'm very familiar with that organization, which I think, to your point, is a voluntary program that we run because the private sector asks for ways that EPA could
SBTI is not, the proposed rule is not voluntary.
The Center for Corporate Climate
Right.
Leadership is a voluntary program.
But this rule that I'm talking about is actually, is going to be, if enacted, is going to be mandatory. So I want to ask you, so between the center, which you're citing here, and the pre-existing voluntary relationships that you're talking about with GHG reporting, it covers 85 to 90% of all U.S. GHG emissions. Do you think the EPA could at least be compared in offering the services and activities the SBI does instead of SBTI, since as you're a U.S.-based government agency, not a private entity that's funded by outside donors to which have ties to have political ties?
We have a greenhouse gas reporting program.
My question, though, is do you think that, don't you think that we should go to
so-
the EPA versus going to this SBTI?
Well, I'm not negating that FAR group didn't come to EPA to consult with the EPA on the greenhouse gas reporting program that we already have in place. I think we have two, the greenhouse gas reporting program and the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. Both could have fed into the FAR process, and that could have happened with senior leadership at EPA. I'm just not.
Let me,
familiar with
I'm
that.
about to run out of time, but this company is listed as the sole source. This is the sole source for getting this information. Don't you think that we should have choices and that we shouldn't have a politically charged and, you know, there's Arabella
I guess I
actually
reject
is
the premise that
sort of
we
an
don't
outside.
have choices.
Right.
I think you're.
Well, under SBTI and under the proposed rule, there isn't a choice. They must go to
Gentlelady's
this
out of time.
SBTI, and SBTI is actually funded by Arabella Advisors ultimately, which is funded by, for lack of a better word, left-wing political sources.
I will take a look into this because I just sort of reject the premise that we don't have choice. We have a number of programs that are well-established that could have fed an interagency process, and so I don't want to negate.
I think I
that
agree with
didn't
you. I
happen.
think that you would reject
Thank you, but the gentlelady's
SBTI.
time has expired. Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate your
Thank you.
testimony. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize Ms. Fouché for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lofgren, for holding this hearing today. And I, too, was happy to see Chairman Lucas back into the committee room today. Administrator Regan, welcome. And I am pleased to have this opportunity to discuss EPA science with you today, where the agency's research activities are such a significant and welcome presence in my district. And of course, it's always a pleasure to welcome a fellow North Carolinian to the Science Committee. My district, North Carolina's 4th, is one of the nation's leading hubs for environmental research, and EPA research programs are a huge part of that. The Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards and the Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment are both based at EPA's RTP campus, where I was pleased to visit earlier this year, as well as other critical EPA facilities like the National Computer Center, the Center for Computational Toxicology and Exposure, and the First Environment's Early Learning Center. Mission-critical offices with world-class scientists and devoted public service, whom I am concerned about if we are indeed headed for a government shutdown. I would like to learn more about how EPA supports its research programs in RTP and ensures that they have everything they need to continue their essential work on behalf of the American people.
Well, thank you for that question, and I smile because I think you know in 1998, I interned at OAQPS in Research Triangle Park, and that's where I got my start with the agency. Listen, just so that folks understand, the campus in RTP is considered a headquarters office. The number of personnel we have, the world-class capacity is so large that Congress deemed that they would set up that separate campus in North Carolina. We rely on those individuals at OAQPS and ORD to continue our leading research on PFAS, on the air quality impacts of wildfires, on looking at how we really begin to address the chemical compounds from emerging compounds, and also as we think about expediting and pushing for our TSCA program. And so if we face a shutdown, and if we lose the folks in OAQPS and ORD and Research Triangle Park, we will see a pause in the work that's happening on a national and global level.
So, Administrator Regan, can you assure me that under your leadership, EPA is prioritizing scientific programs in Research Triangle Park and elsewhere with the budgets they need, the staffing they need, and the high-level backing they need to conduct their work?
You know, this is why I come before Congress often to ask for those necessary resources. It's imperative. I think I have stressed from day one that scientific integrity is the North Star for us, following the science and following the law. So I pledge that commitment to all of our scientists across the agency. We are trying to push as many resources and as much opportunity for that scientific voice to be heard in all the work that we do.
I also want to take this opportunity to discuss an important oversight priority. For over a decade, EPA's IRIS program has been working on updating its assessment of formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. IRIS came to this conclusion last year. It was a draft conclusion. And last month, the National Academies provided its stamp of approval on the assessment, its fourth time in 9 years affirming the progress IRIS has made. GAO and a science committee investigation found that during the Trump administration, political influence derailed this important assessment from being finalized. As the Academy said, it is imperative that EPA finalize this assessment. So will you push to finalize this important assessment by the end of next year so key stakeholders across and beyond the federal government can incorporate it into health protective policies?
We are currently reviewing the NAS and those external peer reviews as we speak. We are moving on an expedited time frame along with looking at hundreds of other studies as well that we have to consider. We understand the sense of urgency, and so I can commit to you that we've put the necessary resources and personnel on this issue and we'll move expeditiously.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. McCormick for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, my fellow Marine and Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Regan, for your testimony today, I also thank you. Administrator Regan, I wanted to talk to you about EPA's role in another part of the committee's jurisdiction, which is space. Camden Spaceport in Georgia went through a 6-year process for its final environmental impact statement. It's estimated that Camden County spent nearly $10 million on various studies, preparing for the environmental impact statement, and consultants. Well, I'm glad it's finally moved forward, finding zero impact in 2021. It's alarming that it took a decade and $10 million for this development to clear all paperwork required, largely because of the environmental review process. Can you point out some concrete steps that the EPA is taking to shorten this approval process and remove bureaucratic red tape from the budding commercial space industry specifically?
Well, I think what we've done at EPA, and you know, obviously the EIS process involves more than just the EPA, but what we've done is we've streamlined our permitting process and our environmental review process. We've automated a lot of these processes. As you mentioned, sounds like it's been in the making for 10 years. Over the past 3 years, we recognize that in order to get these EISs done, in order to get permits out the door, we have to use technology and more efficient measures so that we can ensure that our states and locals get those needed permits so the economy can thrive. So I can tell you that we have looked at how we can make processes more efficient. We have automated processes, and we have also expanded our external stakeholder outreach. Our state and local government arm of EPA is much more robust and muscular right now, and we have more of a finger on the pulse.
You know, I would agree, actually, because I've seen it's taken about half as much time for everybody else to get their approval, so it's obviously working, so kudos to you guys. The EPA's rule is to protect human health and human resources and the environment. Yet it seems often more focused on the bureaucratic red tape, which I understand is a product a lot of times of the regulation we burden people with, although bureaucrats also tend to add on to that because it's a job. For example, in my own district, a 1.5 mile road in Roswell, $700,000 to do a study that lasted 18 months just to see if we could repave a road that's going to get repaved anyways. But it costs almost $750,000 and delays it for 1.5 years while people are going over potholes and going through the process that's so dragged out just to do something we know is pretty much inevitable anyways. I'm looking for ways we can streamline this process and get rid of the inevitable delays that have been making people's lives miserable. Because after all, we're all in government to serve the people and make their life better. Can you speak to that?
I don't know if I can speak to paving roads and the expediting of that process. I can say that with the bipartisan infrastructure law, as far as a whole of government approach, there are a lot more resources to look at how we stabilize our roads, our bridges, and our transportation. What I can say is our involvement in these environmental assessments under my watch has moved much more expeditiously. I can say that because as a former state regulator, I've been on the receiving end at the state level trying to work with the federal government. I've tried to bring that state knowledge to the federal government and work in an expedited manner to get these reviews done. Time is money.
Time is money. Hey, you're absolutely, now you sound like a business guy instead of a bureaucrat. I like that. What's interesting, we just allocated $40 million for a study basically on efficiencies last cycle for the budgeting. And I was curious if you talk about the efficiency and the timeliness, which was supposed to be part of this review system. You talked about how you're making progress. Can you tell me where that $40 million expanded your ability to digest that and make you more timely and efficient? You mentioned AI, but other things that $40 million went towards finding out that can make you better at what you're doing.
I'm not quite sure if I recognize the $40 million you're speaking to.
So I'll specifically, through the Inflation Reduction Act, we allocated $40 million to a study to develop a more efficient, accurate, and timely review process in the EPA.
Let me get back to you on the specifics of that. I mean, holistically speaking, I can tell you that we spend a lot of time, money, and resources on efficiencies all across the agency, but I want to answer your question directly about that $40 million. I want to be accurate there.
With that, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sykes for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Administrator Regan, for being with us today. This is a great conversation, and one of the reasons I wanted to serve on this committee is to help oversee the implementation of CHIPS and Science, as many people have heard, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. And I know your agency has quite the role to play in that. And one of the things that you have the oversight of is $41 billion in distressed communities to discuss in advancing environmental justice. And I know that might seem like one of those DC bubble phrases, but it certainly is an impactful and necessary conversation to have, because environmental justice means access to safe drinking water, clean air, addressing the pollution of the past to make sure things like the Congo River does not catch on fire again. And we know that pollution does not know geographical boundaries as well as congressional boundaries, state boundaries, but its impacts can also be disproportionate. And I want to talk specifically about my district, Ohio's 13th, because I represent the city of Akron, Barberton, Uniontown, and communities that are working to address these long-standing environmental issues that we inherited many generations ago. And we also want to make sure we get our fair share of those $41 billion. And so can you talk about the difference that those funds are going to make in our communities and how they're being implemented across the country now?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to say thank you for your leadership locally and also your role on the Congressional Black Caucus Environmental Justice Task Force as the co-chair. I think you know and understand that there are so many communities like the ones you've identified that have just not had a seat at the table and have been left behind. They don't have the infrastructure to respond to the disproportionate pollution that they faced, which is why one of the first actions I took was establishing a new national program, the Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights Program. This program is on par with all of our other national media programs, the Air, Water, Lands, Chemical Program, to ensure that all of the resources that we get appropriated in addition to the resources from these historic pieces of legislation reach the communities that need it the most. Whether you're in your community or Appalachia or Lowndes County, Alabama, the disproportionate impact and lack of infrastructure investment is astounding. And so I have not only set up a national program, but we've also set up metrics and guidelines and policies to ensure that every regulation, every policy, contracts and procurement have this lens of justice and equity applied.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you saying Appalachia, because I know you're a legitimate person, because some people like to say Appalachian, that's not correct, as we often are corrected in Ohio. But I do want to build upon something and move to another topic, specifically the community of Uniontown. And the state of Ohio's EPA has been working with the Uniontown since the 1980s to fix the industrial excess landfill. And some of the work of your agency is being, and because of the work of your agency, is being remediated, and affected residents were hooked up to municipal water supplies and away from well water, which was welcomed. But this process is arduous, it's long-term, and becomes very difficult, and we've seen the presence of one of the 4 dioxins, which is a dangerous chemical. And so we don't have as much time for me to ask you to go into this too deeply, but if you could just blink twice and let me know that you're going to continue to work with the state Ohio EPA, and I will take that as your commitment to working with our community. But I do want to talk about East Palestine because, one, I want to thank you and the members of your staff for coming so quickly to the aid of folks in East Palestine. It is not in my district, but certainly appreciate you. I've heard from people in the governor's administration their appreciation, and I also want to express that to you publicly. And I know we often hear about the administration and what they are doing, and I can attest, I've seen you there a couple of times, that you were there. But the thing that unfortunately members of Congress, as members of Congress push on the administration, don't push enough on our own colleagues to even pass bipartisan legislation like the RAIL Act. We can do something to help fix this, and that is passing the RAIL Act, a bill that has not received any hearings in committee, and that could happen, and that could be very impactful. But to your point earlier about Norfolk Southern and holding them accountable, I know there was a recent executive order from the president to ensure that the administration is overseeing that work. There was the announcement that you made several months ago in East Palestine. Can you talk to us in 10 seconds or less about how you are enforcing that and making sure Norfolk Southern is doing what they promised to do to the people of East Palestine?
We've ordered Norfolk Southern to clean up the mess. They have responded to our orders to date and have dotted every I and crossed every T. We are almost complete, clean up the waste. We will continue to monitor the soil and water for the foreseeable future. And the President's executive order spelled out what we at EPA have already been doing, which is provide timely updates directly to him so that he has a finger on the pulse.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Williams for 5 minutes of questioning.
Administrator Regan, we've never met, and I just want to say how much I appreciate, way over here, they tucked me in the corner. Appreciate your direct and relevant answers today, and also admire your command of the issues that are under your jurisdiction. So just please accept my sincere appreciation.
Thank you.
One of the key lessons that I've learned about research and development from my business experience as well as my experience as a nuclear engineer training as a nuclear engineer in the Navy, is that scientific innovation or invention does not always lead to broad adoption of new technologies or new solutions. In fact, actual broad acceptance of innovation is quite rare in actual practice. And as a society, we tend to assume that once a new technology, like solar panels or carbon capture or hydrogen fuel, is first invented or innovated, it will inevitably be adopted and be a good solution for the market. However, in my experience, this simply is not the case. New technologies face their greatest hurdles after they are invented or the innovation occurs, and there are many, many hurdles to adoption and then beyond that even into broad acceptance into our society. New products face significant difficulties expanding. This is quite clearly captured in a term coined "crossing the chasm" by Jeffrey Moore. There's a number of excellent scientific studies on the cycle of innovation adoption that have been done for many, many decades. So I hear from my colleagues across the aisle that every regulatory action by the EPA is urgent and necessary to save the planet. But I would urge you to place an even higher emphasis on a priority to stop impoverishing working families through higher energy costs. In my state of New York, extremist environmental policies have rapidly driven up energy costs for ratepayers. It's a regressive tax that is unfair, sir. Specifically, I'm concerned that the EPA and this administration have failed to properly consider this issue of crossing the chasm and the cost and difficulties of scaling up and implementing new technologies. Take the proposed Section 111 rule that EPA released earlier this year. This rule, if implemented, would burden existing natural gas plants that we rely on for power today with strict and unrealistic regulations to employ carbon capture and hydrogen fuel blending, which there are many technical challenges to, including hydrogen embrittlement of metals. Many of the utilities who will be subject to this rule have warned that bringing these technologies to online and in commercial scale will require hundreds of billions of dollars of new investment. This doesn't take away from their profit. This gets passed on to ratepayers and will significantly increase energy costs for consumers and businesses. So under your leadership, is the EPA and the mandating of these massive technology investments by utilities, are you accounting for the rapid rise in energy costs to all Americans?
Well, all of the technology standards that we propose do take economics into consideration. I think that affordability and reliability, along with the technical availability, is what we are discussing. And I think we proposed a rule. We've received a lot of comments. In the past 2 to 3 weeks, I've met with multiple utility CEOs. I've met with, my team has met with grid reliability experts. Congressman Bill Johnson convened a very productive conversation around these very topics. The proposal is just that, and we will continue to evaluate the comments that have come in, engage with industry, our ratepayers and others, and hopefully the final rule will reflect something that is ambitious but also doable.
In the folks that you listed that were at the table, I don't hear strong representation, except through elected members like myself, of the helplessness that working families feel for forces that are being put upon them, costs that are being put upon them, quite honestly, sir, by your agency and the mandates that you require that are simply unaffordable. It is it's literally impoverishing working families. Please respond if you like, but my time has expired. So.
Well, I'd just like to say that I think Congressman Bill Johnson did an excellent job representing that constituency and bringing people to the table that my staff met with. We are meeting and talking with everyone because we understand the impact of the work that we do.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Caraveo, 5 minutes of questioning, now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also have been heartened by the return of Chairman Lucas and would like to thank him and Ranking Member Lofgren for holding this hearing today, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for coming to speak with us. As you may know, my district is home to Suncor, which is Colorado's only major petroleum refinery. It is a critical piece of local energy infrastructure and our economy, so much so that if we see issues at the refinery with production, my constituents feel the pain at the pump, and I agree that affects working families. That being said, this refinery is right next to underserved communities, and their emissions are compounded on the other air pollution in the Denver metro area, and so generations of children have grown up around this polluting entity. I've seen that impact in my clinic, where I treat countless children who suffered from asthma because of these harmful emissions. That is why I was encouraged to see the EPA award R&D grant funding to institutions that are doing research to address the drivers and environmental impacts of energy transitions in underserved communities. Some of these projects even address the exact situation some of my constituents find themselves in, which is living directly across from petroleum refineries. So what is the EPA hoping to learn from the research being done at these universities, and how do you see it affecting the important work that you all do?
Well, thank you for that question, and I think the research, it will help do two things. The first is we see constantly the juxtaposition of people having to choose between employment and breathing air and living, and so it's a very tough situation. And so as we think about the transition to a cleaner economy, we have to think about the communities that are there that we don't want left behind. What we hope to learn in our research are a couple of things. The first is understanding the total economic impact to these communities, while also asking some of these facilities to pursue cleaner technologies. At the end of the day, EPA's focus is on advanced technologies that reduce emissions. If refineries and other constituencies can find that technology that allows for them to move forward and keep communities safe, that is priority number one. I think the intersection of that is cost. And so the question becomes, if the refinery cannot find a cost-effective way to protect the communities, what happens then? We are doing a lot of research to make sure that we're working with the industry and the communities so that they transition together and no one is left behind.
I appreciate that balance, which is something that in districts like mine we strive for every day, making sure that we're protecting communities, but also knowing that impacts on their pocketbooks are real. If the research the EPA conducts is successful, what would you recommend that Congress look into to authorize programs that might uplift the results of these projects?
I think that we have a broader administration-wide program looking at communities that are transitioning that we are participating in, that involves DOE and USDA and others. I think collectively we will have some reporting that will come back to Congress that demonstrates that we can responsibly either add controls to protect communities or transition in a way where we don't leave anyone behind. So I would just ask Congress to be on the lookout for these results. These are very good, solid results that are coming from multiple agencies. We're working together on that.
I appreciate that work and certainly will be on the lookout for those results. Switching gears, I wanted to talk to you about West Nile virus. In Colorado, we are unfortunately leading the nation in the number of cases being reported. We tend to do that most years, and I recently led a bipartisan effort to Secretary Becerra, asking him to put together a federal response to this uptick in cases, which may be worse next season depending on our water situation. The reason I wanted to talk to you about West Nile virus is that because of the role stormwater infrastructure has, whether it's ineffective or lacking in playing into the rise in these cases. Excuse me. We've had a very wet year in Colorado, which we appreciate in the West, given our that we're usually in a drought. But because of that, our stormwater infrastructure just hasn't been able to keep up with the process and the amount of water that we've gotten in an efficient manner. The bipartisan infrastructure law authorized the creation of Centers for Excellence for Stormwater Control Infrastructure Technologies in the last appropriations bill. So I was just hoping for an update on where you are with standing these centers up.
We're excited about these centers, and we recognize that stormwater control is key to West Nile and so many other issues. I think that money is flowing through the process, and in this case, we are setting up these centers, but we also have state funds that receive resources annually. And as the states apply for these billions of dollars, we're judging their projects based on the solutions on the ground, which this is one that we're closely looking at. So I think there are two categories there. I think there are the state funds that come annually that EPA doles out, where we are really grading these states on exactly what problems they're solving. But we also have these research centers that we are actively working to stand up.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being here. Thank you for your service to our beautiful country. Hey, I want to start by capturing something you said early on and just having a discussion around that. You said essentially that the mission is to protect the environment, but also to protect economic development, and that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, and your charter is to try to maximize both of those missions. Would it be fair to also include in that the premise that national security should also be a primary measure of merit in your mission? We have, in my district, I represent a North LA County district, which when people hear Los Angeles, they don't think of necessarily the terrain in our district. Wide open, high desert. We have, though, in the middle of my district, one of the most critical national security assets in our country. It's called Plant 42. This is where we are currently building the next generation stealth bomber, the B-21. It's about 30% of the F-35 production is done at Plant 42. The next generation air dominance vehicle is there. It's taken close to a century to build this, and to replicate this Plant 42 anywhere else in the country, the carbon footprint of rebuilding that would be massively prohibitive to the environment, but also economically. The workforce is all there. You have a new proposed rule that basically changes the way these businesses that operate there. And it's a part government facility, but also a part industry facility. And this Clean Air Act change is basically changing the practice of measuring emissions for future growth opportunities. When they bring in a new piece of hardware, the legacy way of compliance was to look at the average emissions that new hardware or that new facility would put out. The rule change that you've proposed is to actually, instead of taking the average emissions as a projection for offsets, to take the highest level of emissions for that equipment or that facility in the determination of offsets. Which isn't really rational. It's kind of arbitrary and capricious to say, hey, in order to put a piece of equipment here, I'm requiring you to offset to the highest emission output rather than the average of that service life. I'd like for you to touch on this because I've got local elected officials in Palmdale and Lancaster. By the way, many of them are Democrats, and they're also conservationists, which I am. I want to protect our environment and protect our planet. But their hair is on fire about this because, and by the way, hair on fire has a carbon footprint as well. We're trying to avoid all fires, right? They're fearful of losing the economic development, and I'm fearful of that, but also the national security implications of threatening these very precious, these are the crown jewels of our nation's security right now within the DOD. Can you talk to what the scientific rationale was for going to a worst-case emission mindset rather than an average emission for new development, either projects or assets being put into these facilities?
Yes, I think you're referring to our PMNAX rule, which we hope to finalize soon. Listen, we've taken a lot of comment in on that proposed rule. I will say that when I propose rules of this magnitude, I do consult across multiple agencies.
I appreciate that, but I get to less process and more of the rationale for why you're landing on this.
Well, I think we've seen in our prior PMNAX rules that we've left a lot of people unprotected. And so this.
What does that mean, unprotected?
We have seen adverse health impacts from PM 2.5 all over the country in ways that escaped our previous rules. So when we looked at this new rule, we looked at how could we design this rule in the most protective manner while also recognizing that the state implementation planning process is a process where you can build in compliance flexibilities to achieve
Okay,
some
so
of
we
these
have
goals.
flexibility to give waivers for Plant 42?
Well, there's flexibility. The state will have flexibility in the state implementation plan that they'll work on with the federal government to be sure that they can comply with this rule in a way that takes into consideration, number one, the population surrounding, number two, the national security interests as well.
Okay, I think that's very important, because when we say we want to protect everyone, I don't disagree with that statement, but the assets being developed there are meant to protect the entire country, frankly, and our allies from this very real China threat. And disincentivizing these programs from growing and expanding is very dangerous to every single human being in this country and even around the globe. So with that, I encourage you to look at this again and figure out how we can actually support protecting the environment and national security, because they are not mutually exclusive in this case. You are compromising our nation's security with this rule as it's currently written. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Lee for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lofgren. And thank you, Administrator Regan, for honoring this committee's invitation to be here today. As the first Black woman to represent Pennsylvania in Congress, I recognize the weight of responsibility on your shoulders as the EPA's first Black leader. You're tasked with leading an agency that works to address and combat environmental racism and the lingering effects of redlining that they've had on the quality of air and water in our communities. Last week, Secretary Granholm from the Department of Energy sat before this committee, and I had the pleasure of discussing with her the amazing things going on in my district and the abundant opportunities the future holds for clean, renewable energy economy in the region. Today, I look forward to discussing with you the opportunities we have and must take to rectify the mistakes of the past that separated, stifled, and at times utterly destroyed environments and communities that have been prominently populated by Black and brown individuals. I'm not okay with communities like the one I'm from in the Mon Valley of Western Pennsylvania being sacrificial lambs in the name of continued fossil fuel exploration, for example. Having a good job and a strong economy does not mean we have to undo every piece of environmental policy we have fought for decades. Clean water and air are priceless and precious gifts that far too many people in our country have not been afforded. You can tell how long you're likely to live, whether your children should expect to develop asthma or COPD, or if the water flowing through your pipes will poison you, all based on the zip code you live in. Why should communities be defined by 5 digits that are often beyond one's control? We all deserve to have air and we can breathe, air that we can breathe and water we can drink that will not end our lives prematurely. We all deserve leaders who will fight for the marginalized and the vulnerable in our society to ensure we can all enjoy our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That said, Mr. Regan, how is the EPA ensuring that communities are being better equipped to advocate and protect themselves from environmental polluters?
Well, thank you for that, and I agree with you that zip code doesn't matter, race shouldn't matter, how much money you have in your pocket shouldn't matter. And so we have stood up an entire national program office, the Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights Office, to be ensured that every senior leader across the EPA is coordinating and ensuring that everyone has a fair seat at the table. This sort of touches on the question I was just posed, which is why are we doing the PM NACs differently? It's because we've seen that the NACs has not been protective of certain communities across the country. And so I believe we can do both at the same time. The way you do that is bring the community in, have conversations, and have them as a part of the solution. We're also setting up technical centers all across the country, $10 million in 17 centers all across the country to partner with communities. Let me just say this. Solutions don't start at the top, and we don't pretend to have all the solutions for the communities. It's high time that we get these federal dollars to these communities that have had these solutions for decades. Part of that is through the $3 billion of the environmental justice and climate resources that come from IRA, but it's also part of Justice 40. So we have the metrics built in place to ensure that communities are involved. We've set up a national office, and everything we do is through that lens of equity and inclusion.
Thank you. Last year, you completed your journey to justice, toward spotlighting environmental justice communities across the nations that have far too long been neglected or ignored. As you may be well aware, most existing pipeline infrastructure is in closest proximity to communities of color. I helped successfully lead the Abandoned Well Remediation Research and Development Act through this committee to support research and development into reducing methane emissions from abandoned mines across the country. How is the EPA using research and development into modeling to mitigate the emissions impacts to communities that have historically borne the most adverse socioeconomic and health outcomes from the development of energy resources?
Well, as we've looked at the new proposed technology standard to control methane emissions, we've actually had industry come to the table and say we're losing product, we're poisoning our people and our communities. We believe there's a technological solution, and we believe that there are technologies that exist today but will exist in the future that we have not quite thought through. So we are working on a very flexible regulation that takes into consideration technological advancement, but we now have the environmental justice communities at the table. We now have the NGOs at the table. We now have the industry at the table. And in concert with our regulations, we're matching that with these historic resources that will allow for localized solutions, federal regulations, and all of this partnership to spur.
Thank you. That's my time. Thank you for your time today.
I now recognize Mr. Franklin for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for your time with us today, and you've been very candid in your responses, and I appreciate that. I want to kind of follow up on the questioning that my colleague, Mr. Williams, talked about before, crossing that chasm, as well as the security implications from my colleague, Mr. Garcia. But it's my understanding that the EPA is in the process of finalizing regulations that are ultimately going to rapidly increase the sale of both passenger electrical vehicles as well as medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles for everything from delivery vans to long-haul trucks. A June report by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce found that EPA's regulatory analysis of its proposed power plant rule ignores massive amounts of electricity demand resulting from EPA's own EV and hydrogen mandates. And this report, and I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but from the Chamber of Commerce, says that the EPA is ignoring 371 terawatt hours of electricity demand resulting from its own rules, and that this is equivalent to almost 9% of the nationwide demand, or 1.5 times the electricity used each year in the state of California. It's easy for administrators to claim that a proposed rule doesn't cost anything if it ignores the real-world costs that are required to comply with it, but that's not the reality. And I understand that even good ideas, depending on the timing and how they're implemented, can have unintended consequences. And that's a tough position you're in, judging how do we implement advanced technologies while making it cost-effective, also protecting our national security. Is it fair to say that these proposed rules, if finalized, will add significant demand to our electrical grid?
Well, it's sort of frustrating to hear that when I've sat in front of utility CEOs who are talking about the new demand that will come, and what we need to work on is reliability and affordability. And I sit with my staff who do the proposed rules for cars, trucks, and power plants, and they're working for hours to make sure that these things work together. So we recognize that demand shifts, that there are new technologies out there, and that the utility providers will have a new constituency while another constituency is sunsetted. So I think the business models that the private sector is looking at, both on the transportation side and the utility side, are speaking to one another. We are taking these things into consideration. And again, I think we've had a number of conversations on reliability, cost, and affordability. What we've done is proposed a rule. We've received over 12,000 comments. I've been in conversations with utility CEOs since the proposals. All of these things should reconcile themselves through the comment period, and hopefully we'll end with a final rule that doesn't do what you described, but do something that's more in harmony with the economy, protecting the planet, and with where product and technology is going.
So you do think then that the EPA's aggressive timelines, with those in mind, that the nation's power grid is going to be able to keep up with what you're pushing on it in fairly short a period of time?
I think what we're doing in real time is analyzing the comments and the data that we are receiving from the industry, from the grid managers, from technology providers, and making sure that we're all working with the same data. And then we can determine whether or not the timelines align or that our assumptions are correct. So we've taken a lot of comment in. We're combing through that data. We're having a lot of conversations. And proposals are never perfect. You put out proposals to seek comment. The good thing is EPA is listening. And by the way, we do not want to jeopardize this country's global competitiveness. We don't want to rely on China. We want to figure out how we can corner the market with these technologies and these rules and provide long-term certainty for these long-term investments.
Well, I hope you're right, but as we've seen even this week, you know, Ford was in the process of doing a big plant in Michigan that was going to do batteries, but that was in conjunction with the Chinese manufacturer and investments, and they've now put the brakes on that. There's a lot of concern that we're pushing at a pace that our own auto industry is not going to be able to keep up with. Would you agree with that assessment or not?
Listen, I would say we're in conversations. I mean, our auto industry spends $3 and $4 million running Super Bowl commercials about how quickly we're going to electrify America. And then we also see the realities of the data they provide. There is a reconciliation of what's truth versus what is advertisement and what we are capable of doing. And we are carefully looking at the facts versus the commercials. And I would say that I think that what we've proposed is reasonable, but we're going to take that data in, and the final rule should actually reflect what the auto industry can do and what the power sector can do.
Well, I would just ask that as you make those assessments, that you do fairly weigh all the costs and the impacts and not just some of the ones that selectively help make the case. But appreciate your time, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. McClellan for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for being here today and for your work to protect human health and environmental justice in our communities across the country. It is my fundamental belief that everyone, regardless of zip code, socioeconomic status, race, deserve to breathe clean air, drink clean water. And to that end, the work that the EPA and the Biden-Harris administration are doing for environmental justice is critically important because business community has always had a seat at the table. Utility CEOs and their lobbyists and lawyers have always had a seat at the table. Who has not always had a seat at the table are the people in the communities where power plants go, where pipelines go, where often they destroy communities. They destroy historically Black or indigenous communities, or they're concentrated in communities where people don't have a voice. They have an overabundance of pollutants, and not surprisingly, end up with some of the worst health outcomes. And I represent a lot of those communities, like Charles City County or Hopewell, which, as you know, has a number of chemical plants that have repeated violations of EPA rules. And you and I have exchanged some correspondence around that. And so I wanted to follow up on Representative Lee's question about how EPA is empowering the communities that are affected by repeated toxic chemical exposure or an overabundance of projects in their area that leads to more pollutants. If there's anything else you'd like to add to your answer to her, or more importantly, tell us how Congress can help you do your job to give these voiceless communities a voice and a seat at the table.
Well, thank you for that. And I can say that Congress has done an excellent job in the Inflation Reduction Act, awarding $3 billion for environmental justice projects. That is one way money is talking and actually will bring people to the table with resources and the technical capabilities to not just be at the table, but participate in the conversations. Listen, I've said from day one that EPA will use its full enforcement authority where we see people cheating and violating, especially in these communities that are disproportionately impacted. I think we have a track record that represents that. I've also done a Journey to Justice tour to highlight for the nation that in 2023, we still have communities that have a lack of access to clean drinking water, disproportionately impacted by PM 2.5 and other pollutants. And so we are designing our policies and regulations through that lens of environmental justice. We're using our enforcement arm, and we're designing programs to be sure that communities like the one you just laid out will have access to that $3 billion so that they can fund solutions that are on the ground.
Thank you for that. And earlier this year, I led a letter to the EPA in support of protective mercury and air toxic standards for power plant emissions, and along with a few of my colleagues on this committee, sent a letter calling for strong and transparent regulation of PFAS in plastic containers under the toxic substances rule. I look forward to updates from you on this, and with a government shutdown or long-term continuing resolution on the horizon, I'm interested in hearing about the impacts either would have on the EPA's ability to provide assistance to those communities that need it most. And so can you talk about the impact that either a shutdown or a long-term continuing resolution would have on your work protecting these communities?
It continues to make our communities vulnerable if we don't have the personnel on the job focused on community outreach, ensuring that these communities are competitive for grants, ensuring that they have a seat at the table as we think through how to design regulations. It continues to disproportionately impact those who are already burdened. So a shutdown doesn't do our economy any good, doesn't do any of us any good, but it especially disproportionately harms those who are on the front lines of pollution.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly, and again, want to thank you for your work giving these communities that have over the years, and in some cases over the past century, been overburdened by pollution in the name of energy and making sure that you are helping to give these communities a voice and a seat at the table going forward, as well as addressing the disproportionate impact that environmental policy and industrial policy decisions have had on those communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee was quite the nuclear expert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Administrator, I actually did want to come back specifically. I've been at a nuclear event, and I left and I came back. I wanted to extend my sincere thanks to you and your folks at EPA. For over 12 years, I have worked very hard in the nuclear legacy cleanup area. I represent the Oak Ridge Reservation. We worked very hard, and I heard your comments about how you work so well with the Department of Energy, to get a new disposal cell. We needed a disposal cell. Yeah. We could not have gotten that completed without the help of our local and state partners and the Department of Energy. And then if you will recall, sir, you were kind enough to take my call quite some time back, and your agency finally signed off on that. So you were our partners, and you actually sent people to the groundbreaking that we did a couple of months ago. So my sincere thanks for that. Our entire community in Oak Ridge will benefit for that, and legacy environmental cleanup can continue. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I would like to say that your call, our conversation, your partnership, we would not have gotten it done without that effective communication. So I appreciate your leadership on that.
Thank you, sir. If I may, Mr. Administrator, I have a question from our friends, our home builders. We've heard from them, despite EPA and the Corps announcement that the confirming WOTUS rule was immediately effective upon publication in the Federal Register, most Corps districts are still unable to process requested approved jurisdictional determinations. Our constituents are reporting that the Corps field office staff is still waiting for guidance on implementing these recent WOTUS rule from EPA and Corps headquarters. Unfortunately, the rule did not define key regulatory terms. These include relatively permanent and a continuous surface connection, two concepts of federal jurisdiction under the Sackett ruling. The agency's failure to provide a clear definition of these two terms is paralyzing Corps districts from beginning the federal wetlands permitting process. We're in the midst of a housing affordability crisis across the nation due to inflation and regulatory red tape. The cost of homes is skyrocketing. My question, Administrator Regan, how is the agency staff interpreting key terms like relatively permanent and interpreting continuous surface connection in the field? And when will the interpretive guidance regarding these definitions be shared with the public? And I thank you, sir, for your response.
Thank you, and I'll get back to you on the exact date of that interpretive guidance. What I'll say is we have been working very closely with the Corps to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we are working on how we can do this interpretation in a legally safe way while responding directly to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court spoke They gave a very precise ruling. We are now trying to put a rule in place that responds directly to that. I'll say we don't want to appear to be trying to be cute. We are trying to respond directly to the Supreme Court while also working with the court on some of these very timely issues and reconcile that process. I will have my staff follow up with yours directly on some of these jurisdictional determinations, but it's my understanding that we are doing a pretty good job getting some of these out while trying to respond to the Supreme Court.
Yes, sir. I thank you for your response, and again, my thanks for all the work that you've done with us in Oak Ridge and DOE. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Gaston, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to ask you some questions about how you're thinking about carbon CO2 pipelines and regulation, which seems to be a lot of them going up right now, and changing some of the frameworks, at least as I understand them, and hopefully you'll clarify for me. I started, maybe this is a bad analogy, but thinking about that if I was to apply to build a natural gas pipeline, the permitting for that process would be largely independent, maybe entirely independent, of the permitting of downstream uses. You know, somebody installing a boiler or a gas turbine, or, you know, the combustion source would be a independent permitting process. So I guess my first question is, if somebody is applying for EPA review of a CO2 pipeline, will that permit be independent of the permitting of the injection site downstream where the CO2 is going to be stored?
So I think right now, what we're seeing actively occur is EPA go through the Class 6 well permitting process, which is squarely in our court. I think we have in our proposed 111 rule carbon capture technology as one of the technologies of choice. And as we think through the comments and finalize that rule, obviously there's a larger conversation, as you are aware, just looking at permitting efficiencies across the government. We just don't own the whole pipeline permitting process.
Well, so let me, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but the reason why I asked that first question is because the only reason we're building these CO2 pipelines is because we want to permanently sequester the CO2, right? Which is a function of both the pipeline operating and the injection site being permanent. And so as you review these permits, to what degree are you requiring throughout that entire piece of infrastructure that the CO2 is permanently stored?
It depends on when the applicant provides the permit. We have applicants right now who are forecasting, who are looking for Title VI wells. Obviously, when you go through the pipeline permitting process, our role in that is a 401 water certification process. So we would have to have the project in hand and work on a real timeline. I think that DOE, EPA, Army Corps, we're all working through streamlining our permitting processes through the hypothetical, but the entry point by which these projects start really do matter. And some are starting at the Class 6, and some may start with another permitting process that might start outside of our agency. We're trying to get our arms wrapped around that as a government and working with the private sector to be sure that we're all working from the same sheet of music.
Okay, well, let me maybe try this another way then. If I submitted a permit that said, I have a high degree of certainty that half the CO2 I put down is going to leak out 10 years from now, would that permit be approved?
It just doesn't happen that way. I think what would happen is someone would put in a permit for a Class 6 well and demonstrate that carbon would not leak into the ground and have an impact on water quality or pose safety issues. That is the way the permit comes into EPA. I just can't be the grand master of CCS projects because Congress hasn't given me that authority.
Well, okay, but there are pipelines being built that they're going through, and what I'm trying to get my head around, and by the way, we've sent a long list of questions, and hopefully we can clarify this with your staff. But what I'm trying to get my head around is if I build a site that has a permanent pollution risk, maybe some manufacturing site with a disposal issue, and I say this as someone who used to build a lot of power plants, I would often have obligations to place some permanent amount in escrow for permanent liabilities, right? We're now sitting here saying we're going to build these assets that are obligating ourselves to store CO2 underground, not for the next administration, not for the life of this asset, not for the life of this company, but for geologic time.
Sure.
And if you, as the EPA administrator, are providing these permits that are essentially making a promise over geologic time, who bears the liability if there's a leak?
So what I'll say is there are two ways to look at this. The first is EPA can approve these Class 6 well storage permits, and we're also going through a process where the states are asking for that delegated authority. There's an accountability measure built in both the federal and state process to hold the depositor of that carbon or whatever it is. They have the accountability to ensure that it will not impact the environment or public health. So the accountability relies to the person applying for the permit. They have to meet certain thresholds in order to receive the permits.
Okay, well, I'm out of time, but let's continue the conversation, because we've got way too many examples of that risk being, you know, somebody bankrupts out of the risk, and all of a sudden the risk is borne by the community, which I know you've been a strong advocate for protecting those communities. And as I sit here, it's not clear to me that we aren't just punting that risk onto future generations. Yield back.
Some of that is built into our statutory authority, but we can talk further.
The gentleman yields back, and we're fixing to talk further. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Regan, we're glad you're here in December, following up on what Mr. Caston was asking you about. And he's a pretty good straight man, by the way. In December of 2022, Texas filed its application to take that primary responsibility for the permitting of geologic carbon sequestration facilities as Class 6 injection wells. Now, let me give you a little side note about my District 14 in Texas. We have the largest carbon capture sequestration storage facility in the country in Port Arthur, Texas, okay? While EPA staff has stated that they were able to apply lessons learned from Louisiana's recently approved application to this Texas application, the final Louisiana rule has not been published in the Federal Register for comment. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Aware of where we are in the process.
So could you give us a timeline for Texas's primacy application reaching a decision point and hopefully being published in the Federal Register? Would you give us a timeline for that? Would it be within a year?
Well, what I'd say is I think as recently as August, Texas has submitted the materials for the Class 6 application.
Oh, then you'll have it done by the end of the year.
So we're looking at the completeness of that application. Let my staff get back to you on the steps and the timeline, but let me just say this. What I've pledged to the president and this administration is Class 6 wells play a significant role in leveraging and using CCS technology to combat the climate crisis. So at EPA, we want to move as quickly as possible, but we want to be sure that the states have followed all the rules to do that so that we can protect our communities as well.
Well, I'm glad to hear you told the president that, but you also committed to Congress that you were taking steps to speed up the Class 6 permitting time frame to 2 years. So would you commit to 2 years here today?
I think whatever we've committed to on the record and whatever my staff is committed to, we can commit to. And I think there are lessons learned from both West Virginia and Louisiana that will help us meet the mark that we've committed to.
Okay, well, we're quickly approaching a year of no action. So if we're going to hit that 2-year time frame.
Well, let's be clear, though, and I think the state of Texas would agree. As of August, the state of Texas is saying that they turned in their application. So the application hasn't been at EPA for a year. The state of Texas, as of August, is saying we have now turned in a completed Class 6 well application.
We will have that discussion. Did you learn any lessons from the Louisiana permit that would help you expedite this process?
Absolutely. I think we've learned some best practices. I think we've learned some ways we can more efficiently engage communities and bridge the gap between the state outreach and community outreach to build trust in this process. So this is a sensitive issue, as you know, for lots of people. So I definitely think we've learned some efficiencies.
Well, from the outside looking in, it looks to us like the EPA is waiting to complete the review and finish the Louisiana process before it goes on to the Texas process. And I was hoping y'all could walk and chew gum at the same time. So that's not the case. Okay, well, obviously it's my home state, so I'm interested in it. In your discussion with Congresswoman Salinas, I forget exactly what she was asking about, but you mentioned the fact that the EPA watches the market to keep the U.S. competitive. I don't know if you remember that exchange or not. Okay.
Yes.
And so now we move on to regs for businesses where you've got greenhouse gas reporting, for example. You had that discussion with Congresswoman Tenney sometime after the discussion with Congresswoman Salinas. When you talk about greenhouse gas reporting requirements, do you, in that instance, consider the costs that's going to be imposed on those businesses?
We do. We've had a greenhouse gas reporting program in place for 15 years that the larger emitters participate in. And then we have, I believe the question was posed, the center that really focuses on a voluntary program where the corporate interests have come in and asked us for technical advice on how to quantify their greenhouse gas emissions.
So if you consider the cost, back to what you said with Congresswoman Salinas, where you want the U.S. market to be competitive, and you specifically, rightfully so, mentioned China earlier in some of your comments, what matrix do you use to compare those costs to the marketplace, number one? And number two, is there a separate part of EPA that does that, or who does that?
Basically what we do is we look at the goals we set for emission reductions based on economic vitality and technological availability.
And that's U.S. versus China.
It's looking at, it's looking globally. How can we look at cost-effective technologies that, as as we know, many of our companies are international companies. And so I spent a lot of time talking with CEOs about this, but also, spent a lot of time with Governor Gordon in Wyoming and Governor Burgum in North Dakota. We want to position ourselves to export these technologies to countries like China and India as we compete globally to reduce these carbon emissions. And so EPA does take all of this into consideration.
Glad to hear that. I just want to make one more final comment. Our grid needs to be resilient. It needs to be growing. The permitting needs to be fast. There's a move to push for a lot of electric vehicles. Back in the day when something got ahead of something else, we used to say we were putting the cart before the horse. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
It looks today like we might be putting the EVs before the horse. We got to be careful. I'm going to yield back, and before I do, I want to say, Mr. Mullen of California, you are recognized next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for being with us today. I won't belabor the point you made and others have made about the critical role that EPA plays in the urgent fight to address climate change. In my district in California, we know firsthand how quickly we need to act on climate. Earlier this year, we saw unprecedented atmospheric rivers causing devastating flooding in my district in the San Francisco Bay Area. The White House National Climate Advisor, Ali Zaidi, told Bloomberg News this week the effects of a lapse in appropriations from a government shutdown would be seismic and cascade not just through the federal government, but into the real economy, into our ability to support communities and protect them. Bloomberg goes on to note that regulators may have to stop working on regulations limiting pollution from car and power plant emissions. So, Administrator Regan, could you reiterate for us how a shutdown could impede the rulemaking process, particularly with respect to pollution control measures and other critical regulations that directly affect climate change?
Well, I can assure you that a government shutdown would be detrimental to any work being done on regulations that it would help us stay globally competitive and take advantage of technologies that we want to corner the market on, or whether it be regulations to protect our most vulnerable communities, our children, from horrible soot and PM 2.5 pollutants as well. We are doing critical work to stay ahead of these wildfires that we're seeing all across the country, and we have to be in a position where our staff is doing the research and can stay ahead so we can alert our communities of the adverse health impacts that come from the smoke. We're also trying to respond to the drought situation that we're seeing from climate impacts as well. So what you do is you reduce our ability to respond to these climate impacts, you slow our ability to regulate PFAS and other emerging contaminants, and you prevent us from protecting public health. By the way, I would say that those inspectors that are on the job to ensure that our water infrastructure is following the rules so that we have safe drinking water, those inspectors will be relegated to their homes if we have a shutdown.
Thank you for that. So switching gears just a bit, in June I introduced H.R. 4296, the Weatherization, Resilience, and Adaptation Program, or WRAP Act, which would help low-income homeowners manufactured home communities, and affordable housing providers protect their homes from the disastrous effects of climate change. As part of such a program, various agencies, including EPA, would have a role to play in setting standards and guidance for communities on how to make homes and property more resilient and adapted to a changing world. In your testimony, you mentioned the EPA's research in this area helping communities improve their resilience to floods and wildfires. You mentioned how the agency is studying natural solutions to coastal resilience, such as using native seagrass to store carbon. Could you share just a bit more about the research EPA is doing in this regard, and also talk about how you are coordinating on this research with other agencies such as NIST and FEMA to the extent that you are?
Well, we are looking at a whole-of-government approach, and I would argue that, whether it's seagrass that we're looking at to sequester carbon, or the plethora of crops that I'm constantly talking with Secretary Vilsack about to sequester carbon, or our wetlands and precautions that help us filter pollution. We are looking at an all-of-the-above approach to sequester carbon and filter pollution through natural opportunities. And I'd like to say that as we look at these natural solutions, we believe that we can do a lot of them through voluntary programs, through market-based incentive programs that don't have a heavy regulatory framework associated with them. So this is an all-hands-on-deck approach. We want to be pragmatic. We want to be, on that front leg, really ready for the race. And I think we're doing a good job working with USDA, DOD, DOT, DOE, Commerce, all across the board to make sure we're deploying every single tool we have.
Appreciate the answer. Thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Administrator Regan, I want to let you know we've been all bouncing around. We've got several committees going on, but I've been following you and watching and listening to your answers. And I want to tell you, you do give thorough answers as people are talking to you, and I appreciate that. A lot of times we see people with binders and they're just sitting there flipping back and forth just to try to figure out what the answer is, the canned answer. But I want to go in two different areas real quick because the EPA is purchasing millions of dollars worth of advanced combat equipment, and I heard a little bit about this earlier on a slightly different question, and a lot of this includes night vision. And so why does the EPA need military equipment?
Well, and I'll give the same answer I gave before. I need to really look into this particular issue and the reasoning behind our enforcement arm making these purchases. I'd like to give an honest answer, so I'd love to get back to you on that.
So you're not going to war against anyone, right?
Listen, there's no one to go to war against. I believe that our permitted and regulated constituency are partners, and we're trying to do these things together.
Well, I guess I just want you to know, how are Americans supposed to feel about an agency? Because a lot of us feel like that our rights are always trampled on, and especially when you're stocking up on weapons. So, I would love to have some sort of detailed answer into that, especially if there is no war on the horizon for the EPA. Absolutely. Another area that I want to quickly go into, just as my background is trucking. I've been in the private sector for over 30 years, and this is my first term in Congress. So I've practically spent my entire life in the trucking industry, building a trucking company with my wife. And you have proposed a new rule that's going to impose more burdens on the commercial trucking industry. And so if you have your way, these new emission standards are going to make new trucks even more expensive. Now, our truck prices have gone up astronomically over the past decade, and a lot of times what you do to us has such an adverse effect because the new emission rules that we have out there, the sensors are shutting down trucks left and right. I'm sure y'all see them up and down the interstate. And a lot of times it's over some sensor that we can't even get the sensor to replace, and it is causing a huge burden and making trucks even more expensive. And it's hurting trucking overall. Now, with 98% of the trucking companies out there, 10 trucks or less, 95% are 3 trucks or less. Do you understand the hardship, the economic hardship that these types of regulations are putting on truckers, especially with small businesses?
Well, listen, I appreciate, the trucking industry and moving commerce and keeping our economy going. And We have proposed a rule. I will say that I've met with the American Trucking Association and engine manufacturers since that proposal. We've received thousands of comments, so we're combing through that. I think the points that you're making are pragmatic and rational, and we're listening to those. And so what we're trying to think through is whether or not this proposed rule really addresses the full suite of technologies that are available, have the appropriate information in terms of the cost associated, and then the timeframes that we're looking at to make some of these transitions. All of that is up for discussion, and we're in that comment period right now.
Well, I understand that, but what do you say to truckers that are just trying to compete? I mean, we got high fuel prices, high insurance. What do you say to them? Higher prices on everything, and they're the people out there that are moving the products up and down the road, and frankly, we feel like Washington bureaucracy, they just live in fantasy land.
Well, I'll say that we're listening. I'll say that we have made a proposal based on estimates and technology and information. You know, a crude way of saying it is we have done things academically, and now it's time to test those theories with actuality and implementation. And we've got people sitting at the table from your industry and others that are saying, listen, your assumptions may be a little aggressive or off, or the technologies may not be available as quickly as you think. We're listening to that. We're taking that into consideration.
Well, and I'll be honest with you, and I'll finish with this. In my career, I have seen where the trucking industry has made great strides in even fuel economy. And then all of a sudden, the EPA will come out with some rule, and that rule will increase the amount of oil that we use in our trucks per truck, and decrease the oil change intervals, and decrease the fuel mileage that you get out of those trucks, and decrease the life of the engine. And it seems like I don't know who the EPA talks to or listens to, but it's certainly not the trucking companies out there trying to make a living. So with that, I'll yield back, and the chair now recognizes, hey, Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, thank you so much for being here today. My district includes the small rural community of Bithlo. Bithlo is an example of a community that has been forgotten about by government, both federal and local. Because of illegal dumping and abandoned gas stations, toxic chemicals have leaked into the groundwater. Most folks in this community can't afford deep wells or water filtration systems, so people don't understand or know, people don't have a public water source, and it's something that we're hoping to help them fix. When we're out there chatting with residents, people are scared. They don't know what the quality is of the water they're drinking. And as a result, residents have a higher rate of cancer, brain diseases, et cetera. And it's not just that, you know, because the community lacks real infrastructure, social programs, the environmental issues on top of that, it's exacerbated drug addiction as well. Being out there is difficult. I mean, it's a difficult situation. Suicide, overdose, et cetera. And so I had a great conversation with Regional Administrator Gettle, and he had committed to coming out to take a tour of Bithlo, which we're hoping to get on the schedule soon. The communities with the greatest needs are oftentimes the ones without the resources, connections, or know-how of securing the funding needed to take care of these problems. So, Administrator, how does the EPA make sure that its grants, like the clean water and drinking water grants, reach small communities with limited experience with the federal grant-making process?
Well, thank you for your leadership, and I appreciate your questioning. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to say. Thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we have some resources that we can put to use to provide technical assistance to these communities so that they are in a competitive position to receive these resources. I'd like to say two things. The first is we have gone back and looked at our traditional funding at the state level through appropriations to see where the governors are spending their money. And we've added criteria in these evaluations to ensure that communities like the one you just listed have a seat at the table and can be competitive for these resources, and their decisions aren't made arbitrarily. So right now, there's a more competitive opportunity for communities like Bithlo to be seen and heard. There's $50 billion in water infrastructure resources coming through EPA to funnel to those communities. The other thing I'd say is 40% of those resources by law have to go to communities that are disadvantaged or lower income or lack the infrastructure to provide for their communities. So it's your community that you just mentioned is a prime target. And then the third is, again, we have really ramped up our outreach. So in addition to that technical assistance, you now have regional administrators, like in Region 4, that will come, spend time, listen to the community, and help them think through how to work through the system to get those resources. We've got a whole holistic approach there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Administrator. What can our office do ahead of the meeting with the regional administrator to make sure we're in the best place to have a productive visit, right? We'll get some good photos.
Yeah.
We'll show them around. But what can we do to prepare for it so we can have some real resources that come?
I definitely think that your office should ask for a meeting, which I'll make sure happens. I think that the understanding of the community makeup, the infrastructure makeup, the unique challenges that this community faces, if we understand that before we get to the meeting, we are better prepared to provide answers and some assurances. And so I think a preliminary meeting would be advisable. And listen, I think what we're learning is so many communities have been left behind that have so many different challenges. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. The best way we can be prepared is to be armed with the information.
Thank you. What would a government shutdown mean for communities like Bithlo across the country having to live with undrinkable water, cancer-causing water? What would a government shutdown mean for those communities?
We can't have meetings like the one you just said we're going to have. We can't have our regional experts go down to Bithlo and talk through how to solve these solutions. We can't send inspectors down to be sure that the water that they're drinking is safe. We can't look at those billions of dollars that we're dedicating to small rural communities to combat PFAS and other emerging contaminants. We cannot do this work. Communities will be left behind if the government shuts down, but those communities that are already disproportionately impacted will be further left behind.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being here today. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the chair and ranking member for holding this important hearing. And Administrator Regan, thank you. Thank you for your excellent leadership at EPA. We appreciate it. Scientific integrity is central to EPA's mission to protect public health and the environment. I applaud your efforts to prioritize and rebuild scientific integrity at the agency after the disastrous political interference during the last administration. Scientific integrity is something that I have focused on during my time in Congress by authoring and fighting for the Scientific Integrity Act. Going forward, I believe it is crucial that we continue working together to strengthen and to improve policies across the federal government. I was excited to see the Office of Science and Technology Policy release a framework for federal scientific integrity in January. So, Administrator Regan, can you provide an update of the progress that the EPA has made in building and implementing an updated scientific integrity policy?
We're excited about it. Under this administration, scientists have a seat at the table, and we're listening. And, it has really invigorated our employees. We're actually hoping that we'll have a new policy as a result of the leadership you've demonstrated by this winter. New guidance, a new way of instilling confidence that science, not politics, is leading the way.
Thank you. And Administrator, can you speak to the role of EPA's Scientific Integrity Office in providing advice to employees and addressing potential issues before they become full-fledged violations of the agency's scientific integrity policy?
We take it very seriously, and I'm excited to see cooperation at all levels within the agency to be sure that we are not prohibiting the best available science to move forward. We're also responding to the OIG's recommendations of how we can do that better. I personally have had a number of conversations with our Inspector General on how we can really follow the guidance that he's given us. So I'll say I'm very proud of the scientific integrity process at EPA. It's something that's taken serious by all of our leaders, and I think we are seeing the agency make significant strides in this area.
Wonderful. And how important is it for EPA employees to feel comfortable bringing complaints to and seeking advice from EPA's Scientific Integrity Office?
All of our employees must know that their work will be done and received in good faith and not face any kind of retribution. We want to follow the science. We want to follow the law. That is our mission. That is our goal. In order to get the best products out of our employees, they have to feel safe, comfortable, and they have to believe they're going to be listened to, and this administration is doing that.
Well, thank you. Earlier in my tenure in Congress, I made it a goal to bring a lot of attention to water infrastructure, and that network beneath the surface, or hidden infrastructure, is incredibly important to our communities, certainly to our way of life and to the businesses that require sound water. And so as we did many tours along the eastern seaboard, one of the discoveries that was repeated over and over was the lack of human interest in issues like those that are required to maintain our water supplies. Very terrific responsibilities, but failed really because there wasn't that attention brought to that area of infrastructure. So yesterday, I was thrilled to see the EPA announcement for $20 million in grant funding for developing career opportunities in the water sector. Our water workforce is central to protecting public and environmental health. From our pipes and pumps to our rivers and lakes, our infrastructure is in dire need of restoration and maintenance, and yes, a need for human infrastructure buildup. Yet, like many, the sector is facing unprecedented staff shortages. So, Administrator Regan, can you speak to the current need of the water sector and how these grants will help bolster the next generation and attract those young professionals that we require to careers in water?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for your leadership and Congress's leadership. With this $50 billion, we're now investing in water infrastructure so that personnel can have something that they're proud to manage. So some of these crippling facilities now will be revived and will need a very good skill set to manage. We are spending these resources because we've spent time on the ground with mayors, with utility operators, understanding that there's a huge workforce gap. It's about instilling pride, bringing back educated, well-resourced individuals to run these facilities and ensure that their communities are receiving good quality drinking water. I think we've connected those dots. We're investing in the infrastructure, we're investing in the people, and I believe that now we're on track to get more people clean drinking water than we've had in a very long time.
Well, I, for one, am very much encouraged by that hidden infrastructure getting so much attention and focus. So, again, I thank you for your leadership. New York 20 is always open to a repeat visit. Yeah, you've always been a hit, and we thank you for that. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I want to thank the Administrator for joining us today and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.